So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're going to take a look at an interview given at CMI. The interviewee is Dr. Ron Neller, a fluvial geomorphologist from the University of New England in Maine. My cursory investigation indicates that his PhD is legitimate, and so calling him doctor is appropriate. He does have a few apparently legitimate publications in peer-reviewed literature. So this guy isn't going to have the ignorance excuse if he gets something badly wrong about geology. As you probably figured from the title, he's going to tell about a handful of geological features of the Earth and then claim that they demonstrate that the Earth is young. Before we start, I want to say thank you to Mr. Wilford, a non-public facing member of the Science Friends who is a tireless researcher and debunker of young Earth geology nonsense, with whom I consulted heavily for this script, as well as many other scripts in the past. Now, without further ado, let's get into it.
Many geologists today say that landmarks, such as the Grand Canyon or Mount Everest, point to millions of years.
That's true.
And that's because they do. In addition to radiometric dating confirming this, they are full of sedimentary structures and erosional features which would take tens to hundreds of thousands of years at a minimum to create. So without radiometric dating, we would know that such structures were at least a few 100,000 years old, maybe a few million at the youngest. No real way to get an upper boundary for their age though. As it is, we can in fact use radiometric dating, and we know that in fact they are tens to hundreds of millions of years old in most cases, and in some cases, billions of years old.
But my guest here today says that these landmarks point to a much younger Earth.
Well, that's a dumb idea, but let's see what he's got.
Ron, you want to share with us today 5 landmarks which point to a young Earth. But before we get into that, what sort of qualifications do you have? Why should we listen to you about this?
Look, I'm going to stipulate that for the purposes of this video, I accept that Dr. Ron Neller is the super biggest brain genius of all time. And he has every degree that every school has ever awarded. I don't particularly care about credentials except for 2 things. The first one is when people lie about them. If you claim to have a degree that you don't, that's a big deal, especially if you're relying on it to gain some unearned legitimacy. The second one is that the better your education in a field, the more likely you are to be a liar instead of just ignorant if you say wrong things about that field. So by hyping up Dr. Neller's credentials, all it does is mean that I get to assume that he's a liar instead of an idiot. So sure, let's just say he knows everything, and move on without getting his autobiography, especially since I already addressed the first concern in the intro.
So can you tell us what these 5 landmarks, or sounds like landforms is another way to say it. What are these 5 that we're going to look at today?
Well, I thought it'd be good to look at the Tibetan Plateau.
For my geographically challenged viewers, that's the plateau north of the Himalayas that formed when the Indian plate collided with the Eurasian plate some 50 million years ago.
The Grand Canyon, which always attracts interest.
The Grand Canyon is a large canyon primarily found in northern Arizona, and I think it will be the only one of the 5 geological features in this series that I've been to. While the canyon itself is relatively recent, having formed sometime around 5 to 6 million years ago, the oldest rocks in it formed over 1 billion years ago. So it's way older than the Himalayan plateau when measured that way.
The Three Sisters, which are rock formation found in Australia.
The Three Sisters are 200 million year old rock spires found in New South Wales, or at least the rock is 200 million years old. Their existence as spires is much more recent than that. They should not be confused with the islands of the same name in Queensland.
Uluru, which is previously known as Ayers Rock, also in Central Australia.
Uluru is a sandstone monadnock in the Northern Territory of Australia. The rock it is made of is about 400 million years old, and the erosion of the surrounding area to leave it as a standalone pillar of rock took place over the course of about 300 million years. So giving it a single age is kind of impossible, but it's very old no matter how you look at it.
And then finally, we'll have a look at Mount Everest.
Well, first, I don't think Mount Everest needs much of an introduction. It might be the most famous mountain in the world. But also, its geology isn't really separate from the geology of the first geological feature that Ron mentioned, the Tibetan Plateau. So having both here is a bit odd.
Okay, well let's start with landmark number 1. Tell us about the Tibetan Plateau.
Well, the Tibetan Plateau is the largest and the highest plateau in the world.
Get wrecked, Colorado Plateau.
In fact, it's about 2,500 kilometres in one direction and 1,000 kilometres in the other direction. It's giving you about 2.5 million square kilometres. But it's not just its extent, it's also about 5,000 metres deep as well. So that's a lot of sediment that makes up that Tibetan Plateau.
Yeah, it sure is. And the thing is, many kinds of sediment have maximum deposition rates and conditions. And a flood is not the optimal condition for many sedimentary rocks, including those of the plateau. So this is a problem for a young Earth catastrophist explanation of the plateau. Further, the Himalayas are famous for their pink rock salt. The pink color is caused by fossil single-celled algae, and the salt is actually dried sea salt. I probably don't really need to tell you this, but you can't really dry sea salt under a flood. So just the existence of this salt on its own is pretty conclusive evidence that the Himalayan mountains and the Tibetan Plateau didn't form in a flood.
Wow, that's quite a large scale. So tell us about how the Tibetan Plateau formed.
Well, given the massive amount of sediment,
I really, really hope this argument isn't just too much sediment, therefore flood, for some reason.
we know it couldn't have been formed by natural everyday processes.
Hey, here's a fun fact. Everyday ordinary processes create sediment. We see it happen all the time. As an example, the Mississippi River carries 210 million tons of sediment into the Gulf of Mexico each year. Now, what if that's only happening because we're currently in a global flood? Fair enough, but while writing this very bit of my script for this video, I had regular co-host and practicing Christian, Benthoven, no relation, join me outside, and he confirmed my observations that we were not in fact surrounded by water, but rather by air. And we were not in the middle of a flood, thereby confirming quite conclusively that significant sedimentation can occur without there being a global flood. So, natural everyday processes can deposit finite amounts of sediment, and that means that any finite amount of sediment can be deposited by natural everyday processes, provided sufficient time. Further, near as I can tell, we don't actually have a good measure for how much of the plateau is even made of sedimentary rock. We know it's not all of it, because most of it is in fact crystalline basement rock from the Eurasian and Indian plates, with only the top of it being uplifted sediment. So I'd be very curious to see what numbers Dr. Neller is using here to make his estimate. Further, since most of the sediment accumulated in an ocean basin, it basically funneled sediment into the area from all around the Indian subcontinent, South Asia, and even East Africa. So yeah, of course there's a huge amount of sediment. That's to be expected under the scientific explanation. Even much of the terrestrial sediment on the Tibetan Plateau is consistent in scale with a large sandy braided river system, at least according to Wei Tao Want et al. In the paper Post-Growth of the West Qingling at 30 million years in northeastern Tibet, Evidence from Lanzhou Basin, Magnetostratigraphy, and Provenance, published in the journal Geophysical Research, November 5th, 2016. There is just nothing to this.
You will not see that amount of sediment, which is phenomenal, being deposited by any flood today, no matter where you are.
That's true.
But, no one is suggesting that it was floods that deposited it. In fact, we know that a flood largely could not be the cause of the rocks of the Tibetan Plateau. They aren't flood rocks. So this is as useful as pointing out that you don't see famous Inquisitor Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau of Rogue Trader fame depositing that much sediment. In fact, there are an infinite number of things that couldn't deposit that much sediment that no one is saying did deposit it. Here are some examples. My dead pet lizards, my mom, any number of toilets, the obelisk in St. Peter's Square in Rome, bears, beets, Battlestar Galactica, ice cream trucks, a bassoon, a ream of printer paper, Dr. Ron Noller's dandruff, ants, tractors, an envelope, the country of Andorra, Sherpas, Johnson bars, the city of Ulaanbaatar, fjords, the great platypus, gazebos, ninjas, and pirates.
And I have worked, as I've indicated, in various parts of the world, including the Amazon.
But apparently not the Tibetan Plateau, so that's irrelevant.
So you will not see that sort of pattern of sediment.
We haven't even been told what the pattern he's talking about is. So far, the argument seems to be that the Tibetan Plateau is too big to be deposited by a modern flood, something no one is suggesting, and that it has some pattern that is unique. Well, the plateau is unique, so I guess that could make sense if he bothered to tell us what he's talking about.
So it is massive.
That's what she said.
And for that to occur, I'm going to argue, therefore, that it had to occur during a catastrophic event of a global nature.
But why? We haven't been given a single reason beyond Plateau Big Dough. But that's not a reason. What, specifically, about the Tibetan Plateau lends itself to a catastrophist interpretation? Is it full of preserved turbidity currents? Are the sediments graded as we'd expect in a flood? Does it only contain deposits with high energy environments and none from low energy environments? Except perhaps at the highest layers? Does it contain huge ripple marks like we see in the channeled scablands? Any of these at least could be arguments of a catastrophic deposition of the sediment of the Tibetan Plateau. But so far, all we have is just big.
So I'm going to argue that it occurred during Noah's flood.
Okay, so why can't we, assume that these, rocks and geological formations like the plateau, why can't they just have built up over millions of years, like we often hear geologists say?
See, even the host knows that we haven't gotten a single actual argument.
We do hear that. When you look closely at the sedimentary structures in the Tibetan Plateau and other plateaus as well, what you're going to find is the bedding planes and the cross bedding and so on are of a significantly large size, indicating that the flow rate, the flow volume was massive.
He's just vague posting about this. What formation exhibits this? Neither I nor friend of the channel and one of my geology consultants, Mr. Wilford, could find anything about this, either in the scientific or the creationist literature. Further, really, what this would indicate is relatively high energy deposition in some parts of the sedimentary strata of the plateau, but that's typical of marine sediments, so it's entirely in line with the scientific consensus.
If you look at floodplains today, as I have in the Amazon River, and that's one of the largest rivers we do have, the patterns of bedding they leave or cross-bedding they leave are minor, incredibly minor compared to what you're seeing in these plateaus.
I guess it's good then that no one but pseudoscientists are claiming that the whole of the Tibetan Plateau is a floodplain.
So that's a significant feature, is that the layers are not being replicated today.
No, they are. They're just not being replicated in places like the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. It's like he spent time watching the donuts being made at Krispy Kreme.
Krispy Kreme.
And then he has decided that because he can't see how such a process could make his surf and turf at his favorite steakhouse, the only explanation for steak and lobsters is a steak and lobster god.
So just so I understand, you're saying that smaller floods have certain features that are different, after the flood, the evidence you see after the flood, like rocks here and formations there. You're saying they look a little bit different to what we see in the larger scale features like the Tibetan Plateau.
Yeah, because the Tibetan Plateau isn't a flood deposit or a series of them. Is this whole thing just going to be one giant demolishing of a straw man? The Tibetan Plateau has the features of uplifted strata, some being marine, some being Mesozoic terrestrial deposits, and it has top layers of more recent deposition, mostly fluvial from the more recent times in the last few million years, and those deposits are terrestrial and still not catastrophic in nature. No one, and I mean no one, is advocating that the sediment was deposited by multiple small floods as its primary source. I'm sure that there are flood deposits here and there, since floods happen just about anywhere rivers are, and there are rivers there. But such deposits do not characterize the region as a whole. In fact, the geology of the Tibetan Plateau is so complex that other than uplift, basically nothing characterizes all of it, and that very complexity itself argues against it being formed by a single event, since single events leave behind extremely simple evidence. They constitute a single depositional environment, and so you would expect them to leave behind a single stratum. That's the opposite of what we see at the Tibetan Plateau.
Wouldn't that actually, say, or be evidence to say that, the plateau was not formed by a flood?
Yep.
Well, my argument is not that they are different features, but rather they are of different scale.
That might be an interesting argument if it wasn't completely made up, as near as both myself and Mr. Wilford can tell. We can't even find anyone making this argument in the creationist pseudo-journals. This seems to be something Neller just made up. On the one hand, I suppose I should give him props for coming up with a new creationist argument. That happens pretty rarely, and it's nice to see. But on the other hand, this is a classic Hitchens razor scenario. That which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
So when you look at cross-bedding we know, categorically, is created by flowing water.
Well, technically that's true. The phrasing here implies that that's the only way cross-bedding is formed, but it's not. It's also formed by wind. What it really indicates is that there is significant flow in the medium depositing the sediment, but air flows, as does water. And while water is the more common cause, wind cannot be ruled out at the outset. You actually have to look into it. Like, are the sediment grains well smooth, indicating water, or are they more angular, indicating wind deposition? Are the grains of crystal polished, indicating water, or frosted, indicating wind? Are the angles in the beds characteristic of the angle of repose under water or in air? With this, he's just lying. His education is more than sufficient for him to know that cross-bedding is not exclusive to water deposition. In fact, if you're in Utah and you want to see wind deposition and cross-bedding, you can go to Zion Canyon in Zion National Park. It has exposed Aeolian sandstone with cross-bedding you can go see with your own eyes.
So when you see cross-bedding of a magnitude in the plateaus and other features, you know that the rate of flow and the volume of flow was significantly higher, but it is still flowing water.
Boy, was I wrong.
Although much of it is flowing water, but flowing water and floods are not synonymous. Ocean currents, rivers, even lakes have flowing water. To establish that the cause is a flood, you have to look for signs of turbidity, like drop stones, grade sediments, erosional features consistent with flooding, ripple marks, etc.
It is still from a flood deposit.
If you're enjoying this interview so far,
I'm not, and this is just a commercial. I don't let pseudoscientists advertise in my videos, so we're skipping this. In case you're curious, they advertise their magazine. I assume that if you're in my audience, you're probably not interested in that, but since they took the opportunity to advertise, I will too. The channel relies on the support of viewers. Without direct contributions, it would either have to scale back considerably or stop entirely. If you like what I do here and you want to support me, there are a number of good ways to do it, whether or not you can afford financial support. Just liking this video, commenting on it, and sharing it on your social media pages helps immensely. If you can afford financial support, the best way to help out is Patreon. That's where I get to keep the largest percentage of your contribution. Also, extremely helpful are the channel memberships. Patreon is linked in the description and starts at just $1 a month, and you can get a 15% discount for pledging annually. The memberships start at $1.99 a month. The memberships give you access to a membership badge in my live chats, as well as custom channel emojis. It also gives you one membership chat each month at no additional cost. Both the Patreon and the memberships give you access to videos like this in early access, often months early, as well as access to my supporter-only Discord server, which is full of supportive, friendly people, and also cat pics. Lots and lots of cat pics. It's also one of the easiest ways to interact with me directly, as I'm usually monitoring it while I'm awake, even when I'm working on channel stuff. There is also merch which you can find below, and if none of that feels right to you, or you just want to send me something, I have a wish list linked in the description.
are there any other features that you see in the Tibetan Plateau which point to a young Earth?
Other features? He hasn't named one yet. He just made up some shit about big deposits and then lied about what cross-bedding is.
Oh, yes, absolutely. When you look at a current floodplain, you will see evidence of what we call bioturbation.
Generally, yes, although floodplains actually tend to erase a lot of evidence of bioturbation. You see, floodplains have a lot of lateral deposition. These are deposits that are laid down laterally at the side of a river bend where the bend is concave. The formation of these is often from sediment from elsewhere in the floodplain, and that sediment tends to be the stuff with most of the bioturbation. But obviously, things like root traces and animal burrows aren't going to be preserved when the sediment they formed in is picked up and deposited elsewhere. So floodplains generally have little bioturbation in the first place, although rarely none.
Bioturbation is the physical evidence and impact of biological activity, whether it's plant roots or organisms burrowing in the ground and so on.
That's true.
So whenever you would have noticed yourself, whenever you see sediment deposited somewhere, it'll only be a matter of weeks before vegetation is growing on it or animals are disturbing it or whatever.
Well, that depends, but it's usually true. Okay, that's been a lot of stuff that's broadly true. I can feel the lie coming.
And you'll see that in every modern floodplain. Now, if you lay more sediment on top of that, as the geologists would argue, and you lay it again and again, then you would trap the biological evidence in the layers. Unfortunately, when we look at these massive plateaus and other sedimentary beds elsewhere, we don't find evidence of significant biological or what we call bioturbation at all.
Well, there it is, and it is in fact a lie. And notice, he's not just claiming that there's no bioturbation in the sedimentary bedding of the Tibetan Plateau, but of the Earth broadly, and that's simply wildly inaccurate. In this case, I'm going to quote geologist Stephen Moshier, professor and chair of geology and environmental science department at Wheaton College in Illinois. Mr. Wilford sent him an email about this very topic, and he shared Moshier's response with me. This has been edited to anonymize Mr. Wilford, which is not his real name. Quote, Mr. Wilford, Your observations are right on. I first heard the idea about the lack of bioturbation in the rock record from Kurt Wise. I questioned it on the spot. It was a panel discussion here at Wheaton in 2000. He said we must not be looking at the same rocks in the field. Ross's dodge about abundant, thinly laminated mudstone ignores anoxic deposition settings, which are well documented in modern seas and ancient rocks. It is possible to even define the pycnocline in sedimentary basins, such as the Devonian black shales in the Appalachian Basin. Ettinson et al. 1988 Characterization and Implications of the Devonian Mississippian Black Shale Sequence, Eastern and Central Kentucky, USA, Pycnoclines, Transgressions, Regression, and Tectonism. Devonian of the World Proceedings of the Second International Symposium on the Devonian System, Memoir 14, Volume 2, Sedimentation, pages 323 to 345. I responded that there is too much finely laminated shale in the rock record to support the flood scenario. That will throw back the idea that shale really can be deposited as sand-sized grains, not just clay-sized particles, following a few experiments that demonstrated the possibility. You are correct that the typical bioturbation is grazing, horizontal, of various tubes that penetrated the surface for living, not escaping. I feel like this is a case of repeating something that is clearly not correct so many times and refusing to investigate any criticism of that something so that one begins to believe it. End quote. In other words, not only is this not true, but all you need to do to check is just go look at the rocks, and creationists are clearly not actually looking at the rocks. Instead, they're just uncritically repeating nonsense they heard from other creationists.
And I think another point too, just to add to that, is that if the argument is these plateaus are hundreds of millions of years old.
Some are, some aren't. The Tibetan Plateau is tens of millions of years old. There is no reason to think that all plateaus are about the same age, and as near as I can tell, only creationists would argue for such a thing.
I'm going to ask a very simple question. How come their surfaces are still flat?
Well, flat is relative. The Tibetan Plateau holds lots of folds, hills, rivers, streams, etc. So in the strictest sense, it's not really flat. It's less flat than, say, the plains of Canada, but still, it's pretty flat, and many plateaus are even flatter. So it's still a decent question. But of course, it's a question to which science has had an answer for decades. Ironically, it's the rivers that keep plateaus like the Tibetan Plateau fairly flat. Rivers incise channels, but they also move across the landscape laterally over time. This is well known even to civil engineers. One famous example is that the United States Army Corps of Engineers have done considerable work in conjunction with the state of Louisiana to keep the mouth of the Mississippi where it is so that New Orleans has a reason to keep existing. This is because if it had been left to its natural course, the river would have long since moved its path. So as long as the uplift is great enough, you can have a plateau grow while also eroding and staying flat. Ironically, this erosion is actually a problem for the formation of the plateaus under a flood model. The lack of time for lithification combined with the rapid water runoff that the retreat of the global flood would require would result in essentially no flat landforms at all, and rather a series of badlands, which is kind of the opposite of a flat surface. Badlands are called that because the elevation changes are so steep and so irregular and so common that the land is not only useless for living in or farming, but it's even nearly impossible for a human to traverse it without flying over. Something that's only been possible fairly recently. And hey, don't believe me, this is coming from John Whitmore of Cedarville University in the article The Potential for and Implications of Widespread Post-Flood Erosion and Mass Wasting Process, published in the Proceedings of the International Conference on Creationism, Volume 7, 2013. In his conclusion, we can read this, quote, "As continents and mountains rose out of the floodwaters and were exposed to dry land, a number of denudation factors would have been immediately present, including water-saturated sediments, high precipitation rates, large storms, earthquakes, volcanic activity, rivers out of equilibrium, lack of vegetation, weakness in rocks, joints and faults, meteor impacts, isostatic rebound, plate tectonic movement, climate change, and ice age floods. These processes would have been expected to occur with rates and magnitudes that are rarely, if ever, experienced today. Many of these processes would have been local, but their widespread and cumulative nature would have radically changed landscapes everywhere. Because of these processes, the immediate post-flood landscape would have been rapidly eroded and likely had the appearance of badlands before trees and grasses could become reestablished. In all likelihood, the processes would have totally removed any planation surfaces, water gaps, pediments, and other such features that have been imagined forming just before the continents were lifted out of the oceans at the flood's end. In my opinion, it is unthinkable that these kinds of features would have survived the post-flood world unless they were immediately buried." End quote.
In fact, it's actually written in the academic literature that the Tibetan Plateau's flatness, if we can call it that, is remarkable after so many hundreds of millions of years.
Remarkable and problematic aren't the same word. He says remarkable, but all of the context indicates that what he wants the geologist to say is problematic or inexplicable, but it's not either of those things.
So I'd put all those arguments together to say it's not a long age feature.
So he put together a bunch of lies and then things that in no way indicate that it's not old, then concluded that together means that the Tibetan Plateau isn't old. Yep, that's the kind of argumentation I've come to expect from creationists.
Right. So the flatness, I imagine that's because if you've got millions of years, there's lots of rivers and gorges and things happening over time. And
Exactly.
you get an uneven surface.
It should have been carved up. It should have been a dissected landscape.
In this context, dissected means that it has river channels, and, it does. Look at this map of it. It's got lots of rivers. And on top of that, it has lots of topography. Some of it from rivers that no longer exist. So when Neller says that it should be a dissected landscape as if it isn't, well, he's just lying. I count at least a dozen major rivers, and there are more minor rivers and streams all over the place.
But it's not. It's still a plateau.
Except about the part where it's still a plateau. It is.
Right. Okay.
Wrong. Not okay.
Well, let's look at landmark number 2, which is one that a lot of people know about, the Grand Canyon. Tell us about that.
Place your bets on how much he'll lie about that. Based on what we just saw, I'm thinking it's a lot.
Oh, the Grand Canyon is exciting. I have been there once.
Ha! I've been there like thrice. This guy is a loser. I estimate the value of any individual by how many times that individual has been to the Grand Canyon. Of course, I'm joking, and if you're not American, I actually don't recommend visiting, because the former United States is not a safe place to visit right now. Maybe give it until we restore the Republic, if we ever do.
And I remember being awed and excited and terrified, in fact, because I was standing on the metal staircase going to the bottom, and the metal staircase started to rattle and shake, and I got awfully worried about all of that.
The canyon is in fact a dangerous place, and people die there every year. Do not hike to the bottom unless you are a very experienced hiker, and make sure you bring more supplies than you think you'll need. More than one person has made it to the bottom just fine, only to die on the way up. If you want to experience the canyon safely, there are trails along the rim that offer amazing views. And if you really need to get to the bottom, there are companies that will help you with that if you're less experienced at hiking than might be required to do so yourself safely. Don't become the next missing 411 case. Don't become the next Lore Lodge video.
Because the dimensions of the Grand Canyon are absolutely incredible. I've got a few figures here just to help understand all that, just to give you some idea.
Time for big number, therefore God.
So the Grand Canyon is essentially roughly about 460 kilometres in length or 290 miles in length. That's pretty big. That's impressive.
I appreciate the conversion to miles for all the metrically challenged Americans who might view this, but really, I have to ask, how many football fields is it? And the answer to that is that it's about 163,000 football fields.
Its depth varies from about 900 metres to 1,800 metres deep. And the canyon rim, by the way, is about 6.4 to 29 kilometres wide.
Wow.
Now, that's a significant piece of information. What does that mean? It means that
the canyon is really big.
Somewhere in the order of 3,000 to over 4,000 cubic metres. Cubic metres.
And here I was hoping for tesseractic miles, the unit of hypervolume. Oh well.
Of sediment has been removed. Sorry, I will correct myself on that. Not cubic metres, 3,000 to over 4,000 cubic kilometres of sediment. Cubic kilometres of sediment.
Metres wouldn't be that much.
No, metres doesn't excite me.
Yeah.
But when I'm standing on the edge of a cliff face looking at, 4,000 or whatever it is, cubic kilometres of sediment that have been removed, it's inspiring.
Hey, whatever tickles your fancy. I don't really get inspired by large numbers on their own, but not everyone has to be exactly like me. In fact, I would rather that not be the case. Vishanti is already almost exactly like me, and that's already kind of weird.
That's huge. It's hard to even visualize a cubic kilometre. Like, imagine you walk up like a skyscraper that's a kilometre. I don't know if there is one that high. And then, wow, that's a lot.
This isn't really relevant to the topic, but the tallest building since 2009, and at the time I'm writing this, is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. It is 828 meters tall, and so is 172 meters short of being a kilometer tall. That means it is 0.55 Cobra-class destroyers long, or about 300 football field lengths tall. Essentially, it is a small tower the size of the largest tower.
So, how do geologists explain the formation of the Grand Canyon at the moment? Because I imagine that's a bit different to what you say. How do they explain it?
I wonder how long he'll go before he'll lie.
Well, essentially, if you look on the web or academic articles, what you're going to find is that long ages are going to be invoked or proposed. In other words, some will promote uniformitarianism, that it's been a slow and regular process over years.
Geologists are not strict uniformitarians and have not been for a very long time. The current paradigm in geology is actualism, which acknowledges both regular and relatively slow processes as well as singular catastrophic events such as large floods, bolide impacts, volcanic eruptions, etc. Every geologist knows that things like the Deccan Traps, the Chicxulub impact crater, the Channel Scablands, and the Ashfall beds were all created in events that were reasonably described as catastrophic. Similarly, the history of the Grand Canyon involves some catastrophic events, like the formation of the Wingate basalt, or its likely initial incisement as a result of a flood caused by a lake breaking a natural earthen dam. But that geologists are perfectly willing to invoke catastrophes when the evidence warrants it is not a help to young Earth nonsense. It is in fact a blow against it. It means that geologists know what a catastrophe looks like and what it does not look like. And so when they say that something was not caused by catastrophic processes, they say that for good reason. And one cannot simply say that they're only saying that because they reject catastrophes.
Others might promote that there might have been a little bit of a catastrophe here and another one there and so on.
By others, he means basically all of them.
But essentially, they are looking at long ages. That is the current idea.
Yes, because it is conclusively the case based on radiometric dating, thermoluminescence dating, and stratigraphy. A young canyon is physically impossible to the same degree that a flat Earth is impossible. It's old, we checked.
And so in other words, the current rivers created that with millions of years.
No, in fact, there are hypotheses debated in real geology about more than one river system having contributed to the canyon. I tend to think it was probably only one river because it makes sense to me that the rifting that opened up the Gulf of California would have been the thing that both increased the flow rate of the rivers flowing west in that particular part of North America, which would allow for faster downcutting, essentially halting planation and starting canyon growth. Now, I know that the angle of some of the side canyons do seem to indicate an eastward flow direction, and no, I don't have a great explanation for that. So I'm not saying I'm definitely right about this.
Right, and what are the problems with this idea?
I guess a good starting point is the Grand Canyon cuts through a number of plateaus rather than going around them.
Fun fact, if there is a local upwelling where there is a canyon, but the rate of uplift is equal to or less than the rate of downcutting in the canyon, then a canyon over time will cut through many plateaus. That's not a problem. On the other hand, flood runoff doesn't cut through plateaus, it goes around them. So far from being a problem for a millions of years old canyon, this is further evidence of it.
Now that just doesn't seem logical.
Remember, this guy is trained in geomorphology. He knows how dumb that statement is. He's lying to you. This is not an honest attempt to seek knowledge about the world. This is a lie to keep you believing in his version of Christianity, or a version close enough to it that he's happy for you to believe that version. Just like with Flat Earth, young Earth creationism is fundamentally built on a conclusion-first, evidence 109,437,832nd, if at all, mentality. Flurfs and Yeks will both lie through their teeth if they think it will help people become or stay convinced of the correctness of their dogmas. The only way to argue for either is to be massively uninformed, which we've already established Dr. Neller is not, or to be massively dishonest, which is the only real option left to us. Now, I do not mean that I don't think Dr. Neller is a sincere young Earth creationist. I instead mean that I do in fact believe, based on the evidence, that he knows that some, if not all, of his arguments are in bad faith, and he is stating things that are not true in support of his position. Yet again, we have someone lying for Jesus.
And again, when you read the academic literature, I'll give you a quote here from one academic scientist who is caught off guard by this.
Caught off guard by the topography of North America? That seems extremely unlikely, but whatever, let's get the quote mine.
He said, oddly enough, the Grand Canyon is located in a place where it seemingly shouldn't be. In other words, why didn't the river that carved this Grand Canyon, why didn't it go around the plateaus rather than cutting through multiple plateaus?
Okay, first, this quote is in fact from Wayne Rainey's 2005 edition of Carving Grand Canyon, and that was not an easy source to pin down. I want to thank Dan Stern Cardinal for sending me the second edition, and to Metageeky Platypus Warlock for getting me a list of libraries that had the first edition, and to Bill Wolf of the Prescott Public Library in Prescott, Arizona, for actually getting me photographs of the page in question and the surrounding pages for context. The quotation is on page 20 if you're interested. It's the first sentence in the second paragraph of the first chapter. That chapter is, of course, the chapter that sets up what about the Grand Canyon is so unique, including that it goes through several uplifts. And hey, do you know what the rest of the book is about? The answers to the questions it set up in the first chapter. This is the book version of only quoting the first line of the abstract of a paper. Further investigating this has been an exercise in just how real the bullshit asymmetry principle is. That is the principle that it takes far less time to say some bullshit than it does to correct said bullshit. In this case, I spent about 3 hours digging through online libraries, calling physical libraries, getting the runaround, looking at the wrong edition, and asking everyone and their cousin if they had the book in question. And of course, I knew what I would find, but unless I found it, then I haven't done my research. On the other hand, creationists just pass this citation around like gonorrhea at a condom-optional orgy, and they don't even care to actually look at it. Or if they do, they don't care that they're using it dishonestly. Further, of course, this isn't even a peer-reviewed work, so it ultimately doesn't matter. But anyway, that's enough of me complaining about how shit creationist research standards are, and how dishonestly they use this quote.
Yeah, okay. So it's just to visualize this, it'd be like having, I don't know, like a mountain or a hill there today and a river, you know, with water, let's say a lot of rain comes along and you get like a bit of a creek or a river flowing, and normally it would flow around the valleys around the outside, but the water just all of a sudden decides it's going to plow right through the middle of it instead.
Yeah, which is silly. But what if instead the river carved through a flat area, and then that flat area started rising slowly? Suddenly, it's not so hard to explain, and it's not like flood runoff wouldn't do the same thing if the uplifts preceded the canyon. The problem, of course, is that if the flood runoff carved through flat land and then the uplift happened, the uplift would have to be rising at orders of magnitude higher rates than is even possible.
Yes,
that
and that
doesn't make sense.
That's why we do call it a water gap as well, the Grand Canyon. It's a canyon, but it's also a water gap.
I've never heard anyone call it that, but it doesn't really matter. I suppose it's a decent literal description. It's a gap caused by water.
And how that is created, it's not done by regular flowing waters. Flood waters will follow topography. But a catastrophic event doesn't follow topography. The turbulence and the velocity allow it to override the topography or the relief.
First, floods are catastrophic, so you can't say that floods follow topography, but catastrophes don't. That's stupid. Also, other catastrophic events like pyroclastic flows from volcanic eruptions follow topography. Next, let's use an example from Mars, just because Mars is largely tectonically inactive, so it preserves many features from longer ago in its history than Earth does. And one of those features is a flood the scale of which we have no analog for on Earth. Look at some of the craters that have teardrop-shaped hills that they sit on. It sure is amazing that all these craters formed right on these teardrop shapes, right? Of course not. What actually happened is that the craters formed natural rises in the land, and the flood water went around them, forming teardrop-shaped islands, which are now hills. This is specifically because water follows the path of least resistance, no matter how much of it there is. Unless Neller is suggesting an actual water jet with a nozzle cutting through the uplifts, then the water simply had to come first. It's logically impossible for it to be otherwise, global flood or not.
So it's the catastrophic event that you really need to explain that sort of feature.
Exactly.
Except that, no, that doesn't begin to explain it. It's a completely impossible explanation. The only physically possible option is that the downcutting started before the uplift. Then the uplift was slower or just as fast as the downcutting. And that's simply because water doesn't flow uphill and floods follow topography. If flood runoff had carved the canyon and the uplifts were already there, then all it could do would be to erode them completely. And then you wouldn't get a canyon, you get a giant flood spillway, like we get in the channeled scablands, which are in fact a giant flood spillway. And hey, That's not a canyon, and it didn't carve away previously existing hills. So we know what the process he's talking about would look like. In the immediate aftermath, it would look like the portion of the northern hemisphere of Mars that is north of the eastern edge of Valles Marineris. And after a while, it would look like the modern channeled scablands of North America.
So what other problems are there with the mainstream science understanding of the Grand Canyon and how it came to be?
I love how creationists in these things always use other as if the previous absolute insane bullshit that doesn't even rise to the level of logical possibility was actually a good point.
Well, I guess when I stood there, your eyes focus on this incredible canyon.
I can't disagree here, and yes, I'm stopping more often than necessary, mostly to avoid automated copyright problems, which, while I'd be able to get rid of them, are a time sink to fight, and so generally I try to avoid them whenever possible.
You look down, it's deep, it's sharp, it's brilliant.
By the way, that sharpness is itself something else that precludes this being a flood spillway. Floods do not create sharp angles and steep walls. Only relatively slow erosion that is of limited width can do that kind of thing. So once again, we have conclusive evidence that it is simply impossible to explain the canyon as solely created by floods. Which is not to say no floods ever occurred in the canyon during its history, or that it could not have had some of its initial incision caused by a flood. It's just to say that a flood cannot be the single or even primary cause of the erosion which has today left us with the Grand Canyon. Also, earlier I said that asking how old the canyon is could be asking about the actual negative space of the canyon, or the age of the rocks, and it seemed like we're sticking with the age of the negative space.
What you often don't realise, though, that that's not just the only part of the canyon. There is a much larger, broader canyon that sits higher up.
Prediction time. He's going to say that because there is a broader erosional feature higher up on the Colorado Plateau, which I'm going to guess is the Grand Staircase, that is easier to associate with a potential flood because it's not nearly so dramatically and obviously steep-sided and angular. That means that both it and the canyon could have been the results of flood runoff. Of course, that still doesn't make sense because the canyon still physically cannot have been the result of a flood runoff, even if some associated features could have been. It's kind of like saying that because someone has a burn scar and an incision scar that overlap, therefore both scars are actually from a burn.
In other words, there's a much wider canyon, shallower, but broad, incredibly big in size, and then you have the Grand Canyon cutting into that as well.
All hands brace for stupid.
So in other words, this canyon is massive. Now, you cannot create the larger one with the same flow that you create the smaller one.
Wait, is he actually going to get it?
The larger canyon indicates a much significantly, awesome flow that over time diminished, and then it cut down into a deeper canyon with lesser runoff.
And of course not. Drink for confirmed prediction. First, the Grand Staircase also can't be a flood-caused formation. It has steep-walled sections like Willis Canyon and rock arches, both of which don't form as a result of floods. So we've got two geological features, neither of which looks like what we see when a flood occurs in a region. And somehow both together are evidence of a flood? Does Dr. Neller even have a brain? Either he's incredibly brain-dead or he's a liar, and I've already accepted the interviewer's contention that he's some kind of megamind genius, so I guess I know what option still seems open. If you get this far in the video, leave the phrase triangle meme in the comments.
Right, so how do you explain the formation of the upper canyon, the one that you can't explain with just normal flows we see today?
How did it diminish? Where did the water go? Into another drainage system? It seems like it would all have to go into the canyon. So how does this work? Did God just magic the water away like he cast create water but in reverse or something? None of this makes any sense as he stated it, and I suspect we're not going to actually get anything to explain it. I think there's a pretty good chance he's just going to move on.
Well, I would argue that it was the concentration of the floodwaters as they came off the rising landscape.
But it's completely explainable by normal everyday river erosion. Nothing about it in any way is anomalous. And Neller hasn't even attempted to give an example of anything about the Grand Staircase that would in any way hint, even to him, that it couldn't be formed by a normal river. In fact, one perfectly plausible explanation is that the Grand Staircase is actually a series of smaller planation surfaces caused by rivers, The area today has multiple rivers, it has features incompatible with a flood, and it has no features incompatible with river and wind erosion that Neller has even put forth. The only thing he said so far that could even indicate a problem is that the amount of erosion would take a long time, something I do not dispute. He only thinks that is a problem because he has arbitrarily decided to exclude timeframes much more than 4,500 years. But we know that that's just an invalid assumption, based on more dating techniques than you can shake a stick at, including dendrochronology, radiometric dating, ice core dating, and electron spin resonance dating, among others. All of which show that the Earth is orders of magnitude older than young Earth creationists think it is. Really, this is the same thing as some guy coming and telling you that although you measured a table to be 2 meters long, it's actually 2 micrometers long, because of a book cobbled together from 3 to 5 other books, all of which were written in the Iron Age, which kind of says it's probably 2 micrometers, even though that would make it basically microscopic. And yet you can lay down on the damn thing.
When water flows off a landscape, it starts first as a general flow, but as it begins to move, it begins to form, as you know, little rills and then gullies and then streams and so on.
No, it's actually normally the opposite. Flowing water almost always joins and almost never splits. Water starts in various places and then comes together. That's why rivers have tributaries and not, anti-tributaries, where a river splits into 2 rivers, with the obvious exception of deltas. Just look at maps of rivers like the Colorado River, the Nile, the Amazon, the Yangtze, etc. Notice how many small rivers join the big name ones. Then zoom in on the tributaries and notice that they also have tributaries. The tributaries of the tributaries even have tributaries. It's basically fractal, and it's with water flow joining, not splitting. So no, water does not generally split into separate flows, and in cases of confirmed flood runoff, it generally does not split, and when it does, say around hills that it can't erode flat, it almost always comes back together, hence the teardrop shape of hills that have been subject to flood erosion. Further, if the explanation is that only part of the flood water that caused the Grand Staircase ran into the area that is now the Grand Canyon, where the heck did the rest of it go? Where are the other Grand Canyons formed by the rest of the water?
But if that water flowing off is massive, it will form gorges, massive gorges.
Well, that depends, but if it does, which is certainly a possibility, we know what they'll look like. They'll be straight or gently curving and have walls with a fairly gentle slope, often a U-shaped cross-section. Instead, the Grand Canyon meanders wildly, and it has a V-shaped canyon wall, including nearly vertical portions like the red wall limestone. And of course, this would be only more exaggerated if the sediment is fresh from a flood, as Dr. Neller proposes. In this case, the sediment wouldn't have had time to lithify, and instead of carving through rock, which can hold a fairly steep angle wall, it would be carving through loose sediment, which would only make the resulting erosion more straight and the canyon even more gently sloping. Honestly, it's hard to think of a worse explanation for the Grand Canyon and the Grand Staircase than floodwater. After a global flood that also deposited all the sedimentary rock both features are made of.
But then as the water continues to decline in the volume, then it will start to form smaller gorges within the larger gorge.
I mean, sure, I guess, but you still need to actually show that any of these gorges could even form from a flood. And the fact is that the ones in question couldn't have, and he has said nothing to address that.
And so in the end then, you've left with a very minor river relative to the size of the double canyon.
I mean, yeah, sure, once you ignore all the physical impossibilities in a flood forming these features, and that's to say nothing of the physical impossibilities of the flood happening in the first place, first among which is the heat problem. Then I guess this makes sense. But in science, we don't get to just ignore physical impossibilities. In science, when your hypothesis requires what is, according to everything we know, physically impossible, you stop, back up, and you either need a new hypothesis, or you need to show how what is thought to be impossible is possible. Neller has done neither. This has just been a whole bunch of nothing. It's really disappointing, but I suppose not unexpected.
And doesn't explain, even in hundreds of millions of years, how that amount of land that we mentioned before, of all those cubic kilometres, thousands of cubic kilometres of sediment have been eroded.
No, it does. In fact, it explains it in less than 10 million years. It's literally just arithmetic. We know how much was eroded, we know how long ago the erosion started. You just do the algebra and you get the overall transport rate needed if we go with the creationist version of the uniformitarian rather than the actualist idea of how the canyon would have formed. The volume of the canyon is about 4.17 billion cubic meters, and the canyon is about 6 billion years old, which means you need a transport rate of about 695 cubic meters per annum. The Colorado River currently discharges about 27 million tons of sediment per year. That's 27 trillion grams, and if we assume a reasonable density for the rock it's eroding of about 2.5 grams per cubic centimeter, we get a removed volume of 10.8 million cubic meters per annum, or 2.16 million times more than we need. We have a significant safety margin of 4 orders of magnitude here before we run into a timescale problem. And that's assuming that the Colorado River has always been as big as it is now. We know that it's actually been much larger in terms of water volume in the past, since human activity has diverted so much of it, and the current climate is more and more arid than in the past. So what's the problem here? Oh, right. There's no problem in the sense that science has no adequate explanation. It's just that there's a problem in that some conclusion that Dr. Neller has decided is inviolable contradicts what science can tell us. Heck, even basic math can tell us this. Nothing involved in this is more involved than looking up some values and then doing the kind of algebra kids in the former United States are taught by the end of 10th grade, when they're 15 or 16 years old. There is no good excuse for Neller doing this. Now, of course, this isn't actually how you would really get an estimate for any of this. This is just a back-of-the-envelope check on whether or not the creationist strawman version of the Grand Canyon's formation via uniformitarian processes, again as understood by creationists, is something that could explain the current canyon. And yeah, it is. In fact, we'd have to assume that most of the time the river was removing far less rock than it would appear under these assumptions. Which is good, since in reality, most of the sediment isn't just straight from the canyon, but I bet more than 1/1000th of it is, which is all we would need. The actual situation is far more complex, and most of the downcutting was probably done during wetter glacial periods, and we're at a relative minimum in terms of sediment transport. Further, not all the rocks have the same density, again making this much more complex. But the takeaway is that there simply is no way in which there's a problem of too much erosion for the likely amount of time.
Yeah. Well, can you tell me a little bit more about the gorge formation process? So you've got floodwaters, they're receding, and I imagine, is it a bit like a plateau to start with?
Well, I'd expect a mostly flat area with gigantic ripple marks, all covering a single graded deposit that is probably hundreds of meters thick. You know, exactly what we don't find. And then, as the flood drained off, we get smooth-sided channels with no switchbacks or even sharp turns, and any uplifting under that would either form teardrop-shaped islands, later hills, or would simply be eroded flat. We actually find a landscape that is amazingly different from that.
And then you get gorges afterwards? What's the step-by-step process?
Yes, you're on the right track there, Michael. The plateaus are there.
That's true.
And you can see that when you look at the actual canyon itself. You will see the sedimentary strata. When you stand on the edge of the plateau, shaking and hanging onto a piece of metal, you will actually see the layers of the sediment that have been placed there as well.
You notice that at no point does he discuss the Surprise Canyon group of rocks? These are rocks that filled into a paleo canyon that was running more or less north to south instead of the east to west orientation of the modern canyon, and that are exposed in the Grand Canyon. How the heck do you get that under a single flood deposit? And that's to say nothing of the fact that just the sequence of other sedimentary rocks makes no sense under a single flood, since they're not deposited based on how fast the sediments would have fallen out of suspension in a flood.
So you're seeing the depositional part of which created the plateau,
which on its own debunks a global flood, since it involves multiple marine layers interspersed with terrestrial and even desert layers. And there's also that darn Surprise Canyon.
And then you are seeing the incredible canyons as the runoff, as the plateau rose up out of the landscape, as it rose up, as the Lord raised it with his hands.
Which, of course, couldn't have formed the canyon as it is now, regardless of the particulars of the rock it cut through, for reasons already mentioned.
The water rushes off and then begins to concentrate and form canyons. Not just one, but many canyons.
Wait, then shouldn't there be a lot of canyons about the same scope as the Grand Canyon? Where are they? Also, remember, as a rule, water flow joins up. It doesn't tend to split.
If you look at plateaus all around the world, in fact, you're going to see gorges coming off most of them.
Yeah, very interesting.
Even our host looks like he's not buying this bullshit.
Well, I think it's time we look at landmark number 3. And I think I've actually seen this before. It's the Three Sisters. Now, I remember when I was younger,
Holy crap, no one cares. Skipping the family vacation anecdote.
Yes, the Three Sisters are in the Katoomba region, what I call the Katoomba Gorge. That's not its real name, but I like to give it that name because it is a gorge.
It's usually called Jameson Valley, and the gorge is a valley with steep walls and a river at the bottom. I would argue that the Jameson Valley is not particularly steep sloped, although it does have a river, the Katoomba River, flowing through it, so whatever. To be fair, I think we should probably just replace the current name with whatever the natives of the area call it. The Three Sisters themselves are a myth about Dreamtime, so I bet that the valley is of some cultural importance to the native inhabitants of the land. But hey, I'm just a dinosaur, and am not in charge of the names of geological features in Australia.
Just as we mentioned a moment ago, and in other plateaus.
What he means by that is that he, for some reason, thinks that plateaus can't exist because they do or don't have rivers? It makes no sense at all. He also seemed to think that the Tibetan Plateau doesn't have rivers, which it very much does. One cool thing, if you're into biology, is that the Three Sisters are south of the Wollemi National Park, the location of the only wild stand of Wollemi pines known to exist. This species is morphologically very similar to its Mesozoic ancestors, and is considered a living fossil. It is also critically endangered, and there are efforts to grow them outside of their native habitat to preserve the species in case of damage to their ecosystem. As far as I know, the location where they grow wild is a carefully guarded secret, which is maintained as such to prevent damage to the environment from tourists. They are not grown in many parts of the world and are surprisingly capable of surviving various light and temperature conditions, although they seem to be pretty water hungry, which means I'm not growing one anytime soon.
So these Three Sisters sit on the side of a gorge.
I'd call it a ridge between two valleys, but whatever.
Which has cut into a plateau in eastern New South Wales, around Sydney. And so they're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful. They're sedimentary. You can actually look at them and you'll see the bedding that's in them. And there are three of them sitting there as pillars, sedimentary pillars, on the edge of the canyon.
So precisely the kind of thing a global flood would wash away. What a weird choice to argue for a flood rather than against one.
Now, it's not just here you'll see them. You'll see them in many locations around the world on the edge of canyons.
Talk about an ambiguous antecedent for a pronoun.
This one just happens to be a particularly attractive one.
Ron Neller is a lithosexual. Confirmed.
Yeah. So you mentioned sediment and bedding. Some interesting terminology. Can you explain that a little bit more to us?
Yes. The bedding is when you've got the sedimentary layers placed down.
That's true.
I think the term that probably needs expansion is cross-bedding.
Which isn't a term he was asked about, and one we've already seen him use and me explain. This is just a structural problem with the original video.
Cross-bedding is when you have water moving sediment.
Wrong.
This is just a lie of omission. What is important is fluid flow, but that fluid can just as easily be air as water. I suspect that by ignoring cross-bedding from wind, he is attempting to prime his audience to think that all cross-bedding is the result of flowing water, and so things like the cross-bedding in the Coconino Sandstone is the result of water, when in fact it is the result of wind blowing dunes around. And let's remember, he has a degree in this. He knows better.
And the cross-bedding indicates that the sediment is not being deposited in lateral lines, it's being slightly inclined.
Now that is true, and it is particularly common in sandstone that comes from dunes, because dunes are the result of a flowing fluid, air or water, at least here on Earth, blowing sand around into heaps. And this also provides us with a way to directly test whether a sandstone has been deposited in air or underwater. You see, a pile of particulate matter can only maintain a certain slope going to its apex. This depends on the physical characteristics of the particulates, but also on the medium in which this pile exists. Coincidentally, this is how we know that sheer cliffs cannot form while sediment is unlithified, because any such structure would collapse until the walls were at the angle of repose. This, of course, precludes things like the Grand Canyon from having formed shortly after the flood, which would not have given time for the alleged flood sediment to form into rock, or lithify. Dry sand has an angle of repose of about 34 degrees, whereas underwater it varies from 15 to 30 degrees. And so you can measure the angle of crossbedding to distinguish between sandstone deposited subaerially and sandstone deposited in a marine or lacustrine environment. This is one of the reasons why we know that many of the Paleozoic and Mesozoic sandstone formations around the world are actually deposits that formed from wind-blown rather than water-transported sand, which on its own precludes Noah's flood as an explanation. The response to this problem from creationists like Dr. Andrew Snelling has generally been to just lie.
And that comes about because the sediment is moving down, being pushed up and then dropping over in a sedimentary bed.
Yep, he's certainly not lying by commission in this section. That's more than I usually expect from a creationist, especially one talking about geology.
Like that. So you're getting this this flow of, so they're called cross beddings.
Yeah, we know. That was how this discussion of flowing sediment started.
So when you look at if you've ever seen a road cutting and you see everything looking nice and uniform, we can call that bedding or stratum. Yeah. But if you see it tilted, and then there's another layer on top that's like that, and this one tilted, where it's tilted, that's cross bedding most likely.
That's a gross oversimplification. It could also be that some underlying sediment was tilted as a result of uplift and then weathered down to be more or less level, and then further sedimentation happened on top of that. Which of these phenomena are more common to see in road cuts? I have no idea. I don't think anyone has done statistics on that, but sediment tilting is not at all uncommon.
Right. And now the cross-bedding is a very good feature because we can use that to determine both the direction of flow of the water that put that there, that sediment there.
Or air. I'm going to keep saying it.
We can also use it to determine the rate of flow by which it was put there.
That's not as easy, but it's not impossible.
And so that's very useful. Now, in the case of the Three Sisters, it turned out that the rate of flow was incredible. I think I've got some statistics here that will...
And citations too, right? There are going to be citations so that I can look this up myself. Please tell me I'm right.
Boy, was I wrong.
Help me with all of that because this was published again, and I refer to academic journals all the time, and I love reading all these sort of things.
Oh, damn. We might actually get a citation. That would be awesome. You know I love me a good citation.
It would have been a wall of water.
Wait, what would have been a wall of water? Water doesn't form walls generally. Does he mean that the depositional environment of the sandstone in the Three Sisters was 20 meters deep? If so, that's a really bizarre way to put it, but I don't know what else he could mean. Does he mean that the sand is actually tsunamite? Because if so, you'd think he'd quote the paper that says that right off the bat. Let's see where this goes.
Estimated by a university in Sydney, by staff there.
What university? Who were the staff? Where was this published? For f***'s sake, just cite your mother sources, you mendacious stack of What the f*** is so goddamn hard about citing a source? This kind of bullshit will get you kicked out of school in any degree program worth a damn.
20 meters high, a wall of water.
He's looking down like he's reading it from something. Maybe he should share what it is that he's reading with the class.
250 kilometres wide. Now, that's a very large river, and having worked on the Amazon, we don't see that. So 250 kilometres wide.
Was it even a river? How do we know it wasn't a shallow sea? You know, if I just knew where the f*** he got these numbers from, I could check. Wouldn't that be nice?
20 metres deep, coming down from the north at an enormous speed to create the crossbeds that you see in the Three Sisters and the surrounding cuttings of the gorge, of the plateau itself, into the plateau.
Sounds cool and all, but everything I can find about the sandstone that formed the bulk of the Three Sisters has no indication of that. So the sandstone is from the Banks Wall Formation, which is a mostly quartzite sandstone. It seems that the majority of the workers in the field have interpreted it as a fluvial deposit, although one paper did argue for the interpretation of an alluvial fan. I can't find anything about high rates of flow or about 20 meters of water or whatever. I also reached out to both my Discord and science friends, and they provided me with several sources to check, and none of them hinted at anything like this that I could find. Maybe I'm missing it, but it's beginning to seem like Neller just made this up. I wish that were more surprising than it is.
So we know then that the area, the crossbedding, indicates that it wasn't a placid or quiet environment for deposition of sediment. That plateau, just like the Grand Canyon Plateau, was laid down under catastrophic processes.
We don't know anything of the kind. In fact, even if the source he's citing is real, which I doubt, even that just means that it was deposited in flowing water. But since the general consensus is that it was laid down in a river environment, nothing about that requires a catastrophe. Rivers come in different depths, widths, and flow rates. 20 meters sure is deep for a river, but it's not a catastrophe, and also I have seen nothing to indicate that the flow was 20 meters. But also think about what it means if the source is real. It means that Neller knows that real geologists know how to figure out the depositional environment of rock. And when they go around doing that, most of the rock they describe could not have been the result of a catastrophic flood. Which means even if we accept a catastrophic formation of the Blank Walls Formation, on the authority of the paper he's claiming to be reading from without ever citing, then by that same authority, we would have to accept the non-catastrophic formation of virtually all sedimentary rock on Earth, thereby precluding the global flood as the cause of most or really any deposition. Dr. Neller is trying to eat his cake and have it too.
With incredible speeds of water and walls of water coming down in waves.
Okay, that sounds like he is arguing that it's tsunami, but I can't find any suggestion of that anywhere, or even anything in descriptions of the rock that would indicate it's even a possibility. Are there inclusions from the tsunami-induced erosion of other rocks? Are there lots of broken seashells? Has there been significant movement of boulders embedded in the rock? Is the underlying rock particularly weathered, consistent with the tsunami? I haven't read anything to indicate that that's the case, and all that Ron here has given me is that he claims that unnamed people wrote an unnamed paper that has something to do with 20-foot walls of water. Sorry, but given how often creationists just straight up lie, especially about the contents of scientific sources, the word of a creationist just isn't good enough for anyone to accept their claims. In fact, a creationist saying something is true should not be taken as evidence of truth at all. They're kind of like cops that way. They lie. All the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned that in a paper that someone's written, some scientific research.
Yeah, someone. That's the thing. Who? Where was it published? How do I look it up? Has it been retracted? Have there been responses? Has it shifted the consensus? Who knows?
Out of interest, did they talk about the Great Flood at all, or did they have some other explanation for that big wall of water?
Well, given that we know that a global flood has been precluded by nearly every aspect of science, I am extremely confident that if this paper actually exists, the answer is no.
Oh no, you won't hear of
Bat insane pseudoscientific impossibilities in actual peer-reviewed literature? Is that what we won't hear of?
floods of that magnitude. People will write papers on big floods, and I've written them too, because I've studied large floods. And so I've even written a paper on the 1974 Brisbane floods and so on. And I've worked on the Amazon and travelled down the Yangtze and all the rest.
Which of course means that geologists are perfectly happy to accept catastrophic origins for rocks, when the evidence warrants it. So, if there were actual evidence of a global flood in the past, it doesn't seem like something they just pretend wasn't there.
But nobody invokes a catastrophic flood of that magnitude.
Yes, because 1, there is literally no evidence that would indicate it. 2, there are literal mountains of evidence that it did not happen. And 3, as believed by young Earth creationists, it's physically impossible for myriad reasons, chief among them being the heat problem, a problem the creationists themselves acknowledge and for which they admit they have no non-miraculous explanation. So of course they don't mention it. It's up to the flood geologists to actually find evidence, counter the preclusionary evidence, and come up with a model that doesn't involve physical impossibilities, and then test their hypotheses in places where the predictions of their hypotheses and those of actual science conflict, and then show that they gave the better predictions. So far, they're just lying about geology, and near as I can tell, making up papers that don't exist. That's kind of the opposite of what you do to shift the scientific consensus. In fact, that's the kind of thing you do when you want to be ostracized from the scientific community for academic fraud, and ignored at best, or be metaphorically eviscerated in the literature at worst.
You see, when they talk about a flood, they're talking essentially about a catchment flood within a catchment.
Yeah.
You mean the kind of flood for which evidence exists. A catchment in this case means an area where water collects from rainfall, and is basically synonymous with a drainage basin. Essentially, too much rainfall in such an area can cause rivers to swell well beyond their banks. I'm writing this on July 9th, 2025, just days after a catastrophic flood of this type in Texas claimed over 100 lives. Floods don't have to be worldwide to be devastating.
But no flood within a catchment will ever generate that amount of runoff, even in the Amazon, to create those sort of features that I'm talking about, the cross-bedding or the bedding.
Why not? Even relatively small floods can leave ripple marks in the sediment. If that lithifies in situ, then the rocks will have cross-bedding.
And the depth of sediment that's going on and so on. So...
well, most of the depth wasn't from a flood anyway. This guy seems to think that floods are the only things that deposit significant sediment. But that's simply not true. Indeed, the sedimentary rock making up the Three Sisters is primarily alluvial or fluvial. That means it was deposited by rivers. Not flooding rivers, just rivers. although I'm certain at various times those rivers did flood. It's like he is doing the opposite overcorrection that he accuses real scientists of. He says that uniformitarianism rejects catastrophes, and so they explain everything in the form of slow, steady processes, which of course isn't true. As we've already seen, scientists are happy to explain features of geology via catastrophic means, when such means are actually the plausible and well-evidenced explanation. On the other hand, Neller seems convinced that the only thing that ever deposits sediment is flooding. And so, here, as elsewhere, he seems to imagine that the only viable old Earth explanation is just lots of little floods, forgetting or ignoring that non-flood explanations exist, and so demonstrating that something could not have been produced by numerous successive floods doesn't mean it had to form rapidly under a single global flood.
It can't come from that. I would argue it's not even a regional flood. I would argue it's not even derived from a continental flood.
Okay.
I think global, those features, it has to be global to give you those sort of features.
Or it just has to be a river system. You know, the actual position supported by the evidence. And the only reason to even think that it might be a flood at all is an unnamed paper published who knows where, by who knows whom, written by nobody knows, followed by the assertion that apparently, because Ron Neller himself has not personally witnessed a flood that big, it must actually have been a much bigger flood to the point of being global? It is honestly astonishing the degree to which he just has nothing. How do people not see through this?
Those dimensions and those characteristics of the sediments and the way they're deposited.
Right, so they might try to point to a regional or even continental, but they don't want to go near a global flood.
Near as I can tell, they haven't even gone for a local flood. In fact, that's it. I'm done with the Three Sisters if all he's going to do is point to a paper that, as near as I can tell, he made up, that says that the stone everyone else has said was deposited by a river was actually deposited by a flood. Let's move on. I will say that he does seem to explicitly state that floodwater comes together rather than splitting, which is how I interpreted one of his previous statements, which in hindsight may have been an error on my part, so sorry about that.
Landmark number 4, we're looking at Uluru, or Ayers Rock in Australia. Tell us about that.
Of the 4 landmarks I haven't personally seen, this one is probably highest on my list of the ones I want to see. It has a big advantage in that unlike some of them, like the Tibetan Plateau and Mount Everest, it's not cold there. That's a big deal for a desert dweller like me.
Well, Uluru is a feature that, from a earth scientist point of view, we like to call an Inselberg.
That's true.
It's also called a monadnock.
Inselberg. That sounds like it's from the movie Titanic. What's an Inselberg?
It actually has almost a connection to the Titanic, because an Inselberg is a rock feature, if you like, sitting above a plain.
I don't remember a lot of those in Titanic. Not sure what the connection is.
And you'll often find, in fact, they are like ice, that they can be actually larger underneath than they are above.
So I guess that's the connection. I mean, yeah, the strata will continue below the current surface of the surrounding area.
Another example, of course, just to put it into context, is Devil's Tower.
Devil's Tower, or Bear Lodge as it is more properly known, is similar to Uluru in that it's a large rock sticking high above a generally flat landscape. But while Uluru is primarily composed of sandstone, Bear Lodge is made of intrusive igneous rock, specifically phonolite porphyry. So, while they both formed by the erosion of the surrounding landscape, revealing the harder to erode section as a tower of rock, the rock itself formed in entirely different ways. Further, because the Devil's Tower rock is intrusive, it had to cool while still underground, meaning it could not have formed very quickly since it takes a very long time for magma to cool while underground.
In the USA. That also is an Inselberg.
Right.
And is otherwise quite dissimilar to Uluru.
Yeah, very interesting. So let's talk more about Uluru. Tell us more about this big red rock in the middle of Australia. What's so significant about it?
Oh, it's big.
That's what she said.
Is Dr. Neller a size queen? Let me know in the comments.
Now, it's a beautiful colour. It's made of arkose, which is a sandstone, and within that you'll get feldspars and so on. So you get that colour.
That's true.
And I have been there.
Wow. Congratulations.
Because I was there once as an advisor for the federal government looking at how to use that land and how to protect that land.
Let the native people use and protect it. They've been doing it for thousands of years just fine without any interference from the Australian federal government. Of course, that is largely what is happening now. The local native population now own it and have ultimate authority over the land, but are provided assistance and data from scientific studies from the Australian government. As near as I can see, that's probably the best possible outcome, so props to Australia.
And it rained on the Ayers Rock. And when it rains on Ayers Rock, all the colours just light up the sky, beautiful colours and so on. So it is beautiful. But the point about Ayers Rock, it's not, whilst it's a sedimentary rock, a sandstone.
From the Triassic, I believe.
It's not lying like that, as you see in the landscape. It's actually been tilted like that. It's actually at an 80-degree angle. So what you see as sticking out of the ground.
Yep, that's why in aerial photographs it has striations across it. The sandstone was probably deposited horizontally and then uplifted. By the way, floods don't really do that, and if it was uplifted after a flood, it wouldn't be solid rock, and the layering would be obscured. So a flood can't have formed the rock or uplifted it. But this uplift is one of the major reasons that the rock even exists as an Inselberg. It's harder than the surrounding ground.
Then goes down into the ground.
That's true. In fact, it may even connect to a similarly uplifted rock known as the Olgas.
And Ayers Rock is actually 6 kilometres deep.
So when last I checked, the exact depth of the sandstone and how far it extended wasn't really conclusively known, but 6 kilometres is perfectly reasonable as near as I can tell.
Well, in the literature, it is argued and published these days that Uluru is probably around 350 million years old. That's the argument.
Wow, that's a long way down.
You're only seeing the surface. It's 6 kilometres deep. It's amazing.
You've only ever seen the surface. That's how eyes work. Until we get 4D eyes, that's the only option. And I don't think hyper eyes are coming anytime soon. After this, though, they do a commercial, which means I will too. The channel relies on the support of viewers. Without direct contributions, it would either have to scale back considerably or stop entirely. If you like what I do here and you want to support me, there are a good number of ways to do so. Whether or not you can afford financial support, just liking this video and commenting on it and sharing it on your social media pages helps immensely. If you can afford financial support, the best way to help out is Patreon. That's where I get to keep the largest percentage of your contribution. Also extremely helpful are the channel memberships. Patreon is linked in the description and starts at just $1 a month, and you can get a 15% discount for pledging annually. The memberships start at $1.99 a month. The memberships give you access to a membership badge in my live chats, as well as custom channel emojis. It also gives you one membership chat each month at no additional cost. Both the Patreon and the memberships give you access to videos like this early, often months early, as well as access to my supporter-only Discord server, which is full of supportive, friendly people and also cat pics. Lots and lots of cat pics. It is also one of the easiest ways to interact with me directly, as I'm usually monitoring it while I'm awake, even if I'm working on channel stuff. There is also merch that you can find below this video, and if none of that feels right to you, or you just want to send me something, I have a wish list linked in the description.
So you mentioned it's very deep and some other features. What does that say about the age of Uluru?
On its own, nothing, other than that the rock has to be old enough to have lithified before it was bent, and that the surrounding landscape had to have had time for water and wind erosion to erode the softer sand and sandstone around Uluru, leaving it exposed. And before Ron goes there, we also happen to know that it wasn't flood erosion. Because again, we see none of the characteristics of flood erosion there. No ripple marks, no turbidite, no teardrop-shaped hills, etc.
Well, in the literature, it is argued and published these days that Uluru is probably around 350 million years old. That's the argument.
Sounds like a conclusion, not an argument, but okay.
I feel challenged by that because
he's a dishonest hack who has to lie about science to support his obviously fake dogmas that he decided to accept for entirely non-evidentiary reasons in contradiction to all logic.
When you look carefully at the actual sandstone and the mineralogy of that, it's an Arco sandstone with a lot of Feldspar.
Are we about to get an argument that Feldspar has to be young? That would be fascinating, and I don't even know how you would go about trying to argue that.
Now, Feldspar, when exposed to the atmosphere, doesn't take it too long to start to weather, to break down, if you like.
Feldspar, the thing that makes up more than 40% of the continental crust of Earth by weight, breaks down in air. No, I wouldn't like, because that implies that Feldspar is chemically unstable in subaerial conditions. But it's just not. If you have a lump of Feldspar and you put it in a desk drawer and leave it there, it's going to just stay there indefinitely, provided it's dry in there. Feldspar happens to be soft, though, so what really happens is that it weathers down fairly easily, compared to many other minerals. And also, it can be chemically weathered through hydrolysis. But that means that it actually breaks down faster the more water there is, not the less.
It'll be dull. It'll start to, rapidly decay into a clay.
It's kaolinite clay, and it is in fact chemical weathering by water, not air, that produces this.
In which case then the binding of the sandstone starts to fall apart.
It weakens the matrix, but even the most high feldspar sandstone isn't entirely cemented by feldspar. Further, feldspathic and quartz cemented sandstone, specifically because most other cementing agents are actually more prone to weathering. So actually, feldspathic sandstone is one of the more robust kinds of sandstone. And I realize now that it might behoove me to explain this whole cementing agent thing. So sandstone is exactly what it sounds like. It's a sedimentary rock composed of sand grains. Most sand is composed of either silica or silicon dioxide or calcium carbonate. Sand is defined by particle size, and the range of particle size that allows something to count as sand is 125 micrometers to 2 millimeters. But if you've ever experienced sand, which I feel like you probably have unless you're an Orion from Star Trek, you'll know that sand is a collection of particles, and it doesn't hold its shape very well over time. You know, the thing that rock does do. So how do we go from a loose pile of particles to solid rock? Well, just like cement starts out as a bunch of particles, but then you mix in water and a chemical reaction takes place, some chemical has to seep into the spaces between the sand, and then it has to come out of solution with whatever dissolved it, and it will cement the rock. This coming out of solution is usually accomplished by squeezing out water via compaction of the sand from the weight of the sediment above it. Cementing agents in sandstone include hematite, limonite, anhydrite, gypsum, barite, various clays, as well as the previously mentioned feldspar and quartz. Uluru specifically is composed of arkose, a kind of feldspathic sandstone with at least 25% feldspar. Arkose has a Mohs hardness of between 5 and 7, which makes it pretty hard, and explains its persistence above the general level of the sandstone, which is composed of softer rocks, as well as unlithified sediments.
Now, we don't see that on the surface of Uluru.
Well, he shouldn't. In terms of mechanical weathering, arkose is slow to weather. And in terms of chemical weathering, the area is a desert, and so there's no particular reason to expect rapid transformation of the feldspar into kaolinite, since that is the result of hydrolysis, not just general exposure to air.
What we see there is feldspar that looks wonderful. Well, we know, though, that when feldspar is exposed to the atmosphere, particularly a humid atmosphere, it doesn't look as though it's been weathered. It doesn't look as though it's breaking down.
Given that Uluru definitely looks weathered, and that he doesn't bother with a citation, I'm calling bullshit. You can't weather a rock without weathering the minerals it's composed of, and Uluru is weathered.
And yet, the argument is that it's been there for 350 million years.
Yep.
A wet atmosphere, also high temperatures.
Wow, good thing the area around Uluru is semi-arid, being just shy of being a desert. On average, the area gets about 30.8 centimeters per year of rain, whereas the cutoff for a desert is 25 centimeters per year. And of course, he's acting like the rock itself isn't weathered, but it is. The scientific explanation for Uluru isn't that the sandstone it's made of isn't weathered, just that it weathers more slowly than the surrounding sediment. If that happens, then you will get an Inselberg at some point in the life of the geological feature. Eventually, it will all wither away or just be buried again, and will no longer be an Inselberg. But the fact that it is right now doesn't really require any more explanation than a bit of folding and differential weathering. We have that, so here we are, with Uluru being quite old, and that not being a problem in the least, unless you decide to just lie about how quickly arkose weathers away. And if you want to pretend that Uluru isn't weathered, even though it very obviously is,
then it will start to break down.
Which it is.
To break down. I would have expected then that the Ayers Rock would have actually weathered away long ago.
But no one gives a f*** what a hack like Deller thinks. Produce evidence or shut the fuck up and let the grown-ups get back to science. Of course, fortunately, no one in the field pays any mind to this guy, just like no one involved in spaceflight is paying attention to the flat earthers.
Reasonably rapidly, certainly not taking 350 million years.
You think he has numbers on that? Because last time I was able to look up numbers for his claim, he was off by about 4 orders of magnitude. And of course, once again, he's not bothering to give us a source so we can look this up. We're still just vague posting, and in a way that contradicts the conclusions of everyone who actually comes to study this formation without a pre-chosen conclusion. Like, what would it matter to the scientific community if Uluru were 4,000 years old instead of 300 million years old? It would only matter in that we want to know the right answer. So since he's happy to leave it at his word or the word of all the actual experts who dedicated their lives to this and who can actually do the work to be published and form the consensus view, I'm going to not side with him. That's the problem with going against the science. You're perfectly welcome to do it, and sometimes you'll even succeed at bringing the consensus around. But to do so, you actually have to bring something to the table. Bring your hypothesis, your tests of it, your measurements, your data tables, your citations. Instead, Neller has brought "Trust Me, Bro," which is normally a really uncompelling thing, but is made even less compelling since we already have seen that he'll just make it up and straight out lie to support his claims. So we can't trust him, bro or not.
Long before 350 million years.
Sure would be nice to get the math on that, like the initial volume of the surrounding sediment and rock, the weathering rate of that sediment, the initial volume of Uluru, the weathering rate of that, all compared to paleoclimate data so that we can actually see how these rates would have changed over time with wind, water, humidity, and temperature. That's the kind of thing we would need to assess this without the use of actual dating techniques like stratigraphy and radiometric dating. Of course, we do have stratigraphy and radiometric dating, and no creationist or anyone else has ever managed to make a critique of either that doesn't come down to, but if you believe in magic, then maybe these things don't work, and I want them not to work, so I say that magic did happen. That's not really a good reason for the scientific community to get rid of them. So we happen to know for a fact about how old Uluru is, and just whining that maybe it should have been weathered too much without stating why you think that or how much it should have been weathered and how you know, does nothing to shift the conclusion that Uluru is in fact an ancient rock that has been weathering more slowly than the surrounding rock for hundreds of millions of years.
Okay, but the location of Uluru, it doesn't seem like a very humid place.
Because it's not. As I've said, it's semi-arid.
No, that's correct. But I think it's still stretching the argument 350 million years, because even in even in a drier environment, one without the intense humidity you might get elsewhere, you're still going to see the breakdown of Feldspar.
Which we do. Uluru isn't unweathered. You can just look at it. In this picture, you can see the water flowing from the top of Uluru in 2021. Those channels it's being funneled into are from weathering, and that water is continuing to weather the rock both mechanically and chemically. But is the rate of weathering equal to or greater than that of the surrounding landscape? So again, unless we're going to be given numbers, there's no reason to think that this situation couldn't occur over any indefinite period. I would love to go more in depth about this one, but without getting any citations and there being no discussion of this as a problem or question in the actual scientific literature that I can find, there isn't much to say beyond once again pointing out that that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Also, there's no reason to think that the weathering has been going on for so long. That's how long it's been since the rocks formed. But the actual existence of Uluru as a distinct thing on the landscape as opposed to a subterranean formation you wouldn't be able to see if you walked past it is more like 70 million years at the latest. So by the time the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, it may only have been a low hill. At the oldest, it maybe started 250 million years ago to be a distinct Inselberg. We don't actually know because we don't know how much deposition there was above it because, well, it's gone. That rock doesn't exist anymore.
It's still going to happen. It's not going to take 350 million years.
Well, that isn't the consensus on the age of the Inselberg, but the rock of which it's made. But since before the weathering started, it was entirely underground, we don't have to worry about that time.
Also, it clashes with existing arguments about inland Australia, where over 350 million years it hasn't been arid.
It has varied, as I'm sure has the rate of weathering. But again, as long as the rate of weathering of Uluru is lower than that of the surrounding landscape, it will persist as an Inselberg until it's entirely weathered away. Do you think Neller here has any evidence of its original volume so he could even begin to do this math? This argument is essentially the same as the argument that Kent Hovind makes about Jupiter, noticing that it gives off about twice as much heat as it receives from the sun. According to Hovind, that can't persist for 4.5 billion years, but he never says why. He just compares it to a coffee cup with coffee cooling to ambient temperature. And to be fair, that is actually what's happening with Jupiter to some degree, but it ignores some things. We know how hot coffee can be to start off with. It can't really be any hotter than 100 Celsius, which kind of puts an upper limit on how old coffee can be in any given environment, given a particular temperature above ambient. But what's the upper limit on Jupiter's temperature? Well, I don't really think there is one except for the limit that at a certain temperature the particles in Jupiter would be traveling at the speed of light, which they can't, but that's the limit of all temperature, and it's way beyond quadrillion Celsius. So we can just say that for practical purposes, it doesn't really have a limit. And if you do the math, just assuming that the heat released by Jupiter is all residual heat from its formation, then you find that sure, Jupiter would have been red hot when it first formed, but so what? But also, we know that much, if not most of the heat it gives off is from nuclear decay. Jupiter is highly radioactive, and probes sent there by humans need significant shielding lest the radiation damage their electronics. Radiation produces heat, something young Earthers know all too well. So we can't assume that the heat being given off is coming from an initial pool of thermal energy to which nothing can be added. This is directly parallel to this. We don't have any numbers for starting conditions, and we don't have good reason to think that the rates involved have been constant. And we also don't know that the erosion and weathering has been constant during the 250 to 70 million years during which the weathering has been occurring on net. There may have been periods of deposition that slowed or even halted the weathering. The weathering may have been slower. We don't know the initial volumes such that we could even use rates to give an age. But what we do have is dating techniques that are reliable and accurate that tell us that this rock is about 300 million years old, and that it has been exposed for less than that, although how much less is hard to say.
It's actually been other climatic zones as well, and inland seas, all sorts of things have happened. So again, I think it's stretching the imagination to argue that the particular sandstone with its feldspar is still sitting there looking prime rather than decaying.
That would indeed be silly. That's why no one says that. Once again, Neller just has a straw man to beat up, not an actual argument that's being put forth by any scientists.
Right, so even though it's not very humid today, if you assume 350 million years of history, the climate's changing and you've got...
Even without the humidity, you would still see change.
Which we do. I can't find anyone saying that Uluru is now as it was 300 or 350 million years ago. It's obviously not. It has visible erosion on it. This is some Dennis Noble level bullshit right here.
In your opinion then, how was Uluru exposed? How did it get to the spot, get to the way it looks like today?
$10 says he explains it with flood runoff, and at no point will he pick out any feature of Uluru and the surrounding landscape that shows signs of having been formed by a flood, deposition, or erosion.
Well, Uluru is a more, let's say it's a more resistant rock than the surrounding terrain.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like that right there explains, virtually everything about it that he has problems with. But okay.
The geology of the surrounding area, the surrounding rocks are more easily weathered. And so one would have expected, first of all, that those rocks would have decayed or broken apart more rapidly.
That's true.
And Uluru being more resistant to that.
Despite being made of feldspar that breaks down oh so fast. It's almost like that whole point was just bullshit.
But equally, given the surrounding area is a lovely plain, it again comes back to a global flood.
Now imagine that instead of a flood that we categorically know didn't happen for many reasons, including that it's physically impossible as imagined by young Earthers, we just have processes with a few orders of magnitude less intensity and a few orders of magnitude more time. Oh my goodness, suddenly it all works out. Doesn't require magic on multiple levels, and is consistent not just with the local geology, but the geological history derived from the whole planet. What a neat explanation. And of course, if a flood has caused this, then there would be evidence of floodwaters. There isn't.
That as the land is raised up and the waters are washing away all those rocks that are actually susceptible, then it's taken away the weak rock around it, and what's left is a bit of strong rock in the middle called an Inselberg or Uluru. I think it's a simple explanation.
Sure, it's simple. It just contradicts all the available evidence. I mean, look, if your kid has his face smeared with melted chocolate and cookie crumbs, and the cookie jar that had chocolate chip cookies in it is now empty, you might think that your kid got out a stepladder, climbed up to where he could reach the cookies, extracted the cookies, climbed back down, put away the stepladder, and ate the cookies. But your kid says that actually the cookies got washed away in a flood. That second explanation might seem simpler. I mean, a flood could do that, and in fewer steps than the whole explanation involving climbing and ladders. But of course, there's also no sign of flooding anywhere else, and nothing about the more complex explanation is at odds with the evidence, unlike the flood. So what do you think is more likely? Obviously not the flood. That's how it is in geology. There is lots of evidence of non-flood occurrences causing all sorts of deposition and erosion. We have not even the minimum of expected evidence for a global flood. And so no matter how simple the explanation of a global flood might be, it's the wrong explanation.
Because that flat plain is extensively large.
Right.
I guess we're just doubling down on a big number, therefore God. I wonder, how big does a plane have to be before it has to be a magical plane, rather than a normal old regular plane formed by natural processes?
So yeah, it really is just It'd be like when you've got I think I remember when I used to do kayaking at the Brisbane River.
It's like you could see his brain buffering.
We had a bit of a flood that went on, and there were certain areas where you'd have the bank of the river sort of covered in sediment, and then after the flood, certain spots got eroded, but there were some rock features which stayed there and sort of poked their head up,
Yes.
above the sediment. So it's a bit like that, but on a large scale.
Yes.
Essentially, yes, it's the same kind of thing. The question, though, is do we explain it through evident means or made-up means? Science goes with evident means. Flood geology goes with made-up means. I know which of those is more plausible.
So to me, it again comes back to evidence of a biblical flood.
Of which none has been provided.
That a vast quantity of sediment or vast quantity of rock has been removed in the weaker geology, leaving these features which are more resistant rock.
Well, that much is true, although I'd love to know if he has an estimate as to how much and how he got that estimate.
Standing there as beautiful icons, beautiful landmarks.
Excellent. Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does, unless you think about it and know the first thing about geology. Then it doesn't make any sense at all.
Now, we've done 4 landmarks so far.
We sure have, and I think that makes this a good point to stop this video before we get into the next one, Mount Everest, which is basically the same as the first one, but whatever, let's do it.
We've got one more to go. What's the 5th landmark that points to a young Earth?
It's Mount Everest.
Well, I thought we'd raise the topic of Mount Everest.
This is not that long a video. He doesn't need to pretend that we've forgotten already.
Now, I've chosen that deliberately because one of the fascinating questions I get asked when I travel around Australia and I might speak at churches or youth groups, one of the more common questions I'm asked is, where did the floodwaters go?
It's a good question, because there isn't even close to enough water to flood the whole Earth. So, if at one time there was that much water, it must have disappeared somehow. Did it go to space? Was it deleted from existence by God? Is it underground? What's the deal?
If there was a biblical flood, where did the floodwaters go? And I'd ask the question, what do you mean, where did the floodwaters go?
I mean, just that. The volume of water today is insufficient to flood the world. So if the world was flooded, and now there isn't enough water for that to happen, then we have missing water. It's like if I said I had 20 people over for wine and gave them each their own wine glass, but then you noticed that I only have 8 wine glasses. You'd be justified in asking where the other dozen wine glasses that I must have had were. Maybe they broke. Maybe I didn't like them and tossed them away. But there has to be some answer. Also, this is a really weird way to start talking about Mount Everest, which you might know is not composed of flood water. In fact, it also has evaporites, which kind of preclude it from having formed in a flood. But hey, what's a few physical impossibilities between friends, right?
Well, they go, well, if they covered Mount Everest, where did they go?
Oh, we're going to go with there were not tall mountains before the flood. Even if that's true, that doesn't make Mount Everest evidence of a flood. It just means that its existence at that elevation isn't really a problem for a flood on its own. That's not what evidence is. Evidence provides positive empirical support for a claim. Just saying something isn't a problem for a claim doesn't make that thing evidence for the claim. Now, don't get me wrong, it's important to counter alleged problems to a claim if you're trying to advocate for that claim. But the title of this talk is Famous Landmarks That Confirm Young Earth, which means that the landmarks are supposed to provide evidence for a flood on their own, not just be a problem for a global flood.
And it's an interesting question.
I can agree with that.
But what it does, I think, it reflects a inability of the person to understand that Mount Everest wasn't there.
Okay, so maybe assuming Mount Everest is a pre-flood mountain causes the questioner to overestimate the scope of the problem of the missing water, but it still remains. Even if the highest elevation on land on the whole planet right now were only 250 feet or 73 meters, there still wouldn't be enough water to flood the whole Earth. Because if you melted all the ice on the ice caps and all the glaciers, the seas would rise about that much. That means that if all the ice melted, then most of Atlanta, Georgia would be above water, although it would be a coastal town.
Wait, you're saying, so Mount Everest, 4,500 years ago, just before the flood, you don't think it was there?
And yeah, it's just as crazy as our host is making it seem. There are hundreds of meters of ordinary marine sediment there, not to mention that the Himalayas are chock full of very thick salt deposits that formed from the evaporation of seas. And while not all salt deposits are evaporites, We know these are because they also contain the fossilized remains of sea-dwelling photosynthetic algae. How could that possibly form during a flood? You don't normally get a whole sea's worth of evaporation in the middle of a flood, and yet, there it is, in the Himalayas. Also, from now on, I'm going to talk about the geology of the Himalayas and Mount Everest interchangeably. So if you hear me say Mount Everest, just know that I mean it and the mountains around it. Further, the sedimentary layers are not mixed together, meaning they had to have lithified before the uplift that formed the mountains. That's a process that you can't just squeeze into a year-long flood. So yeah, we know that Mount Everest is much, much older than 4,500 years. So regardless of how tall it is, and what that may or may not mean for the volume of the floodwaters during Noah's flood, we know that it cannot be as young as Kneller needs it to be.
How do you explain that?
I bet he explains it with mendacity. There's a vocabulary word for the day.
Mount Everest is, again, sedimentary, but very much a limestone with some shales and all this sort of thing, particularly up the top.
Uh-oh, limestone doesn't precipitate out in a flood. That's an even bigger problem than a lithification in my book. Limestone precipitates under ideal conditions at a rate of a few dozen centimeters per millennium. Ideal conditions, by the way, are warm, calm, and slightly acidic water. I guess that given the heat problem, the water being warm wouldn't be a problem. I can't say about the acidity of the floodwater, but I can say for certain that it would not have been calm, especially since it's apparently sloshing all over the place, causing all the crossbedding ever, at least according to Kneller here. Now, in a lab, you can get lime to precipitate out of water faster than this by inducing flocculation. That is the formation of floccules. Floccules are conglomerations of sediment that form around some seed or nucleus. This effectively increases the grain size and so makes it easier for gravity to overcome Brownian forces in the water, resulting in higher rates of sediment deposition. The problem, though, is that floccules can be seen in the stone that formed via flocculation, and there has never, as far as I can tell, been a limestone found outside of being produced in a lab that has evidence of floccules. It's kind of like growing artificial diamonds. Sure, you can do it really fast in a lab given conditions that we have never seen in nature, and that result in diamonds that are distinguishable from any known natural diamond. Similarly, in a lab, given conditions that we've never seen in nature, you can get rapid lime deposition. But that limestone will be distinct from all known natural limestone, and so that process can't be used to explain any known natural limestone, including that on Mount Everest.
But it is riddled with fossils, marine fossils.
As is typical for marine limestone, given that it's basically made of fossils, which itself is another problem. You see, there are way too many preserved marine organisms in the limestone of the world to have been alive at the same time. But flood geology proposes that they were all alive during the just over a year of Noah's flood. That simply isn't a possibility. They couldn't all get enough sunlight, and the larger organisms like fish, most crustaceans, cephalopods, and the like couldn't breathe because their oxygen exchange organs would be fouled by a thick sludge of sharp-edged microbes. So let's see. Just with Mount Everest so far, we've seen problems for the flood in biology, sedimentology, and lithology. Wow, that sure is some great evidence against the flood. And we still don't actually have an answer as to where the floodwaters went, which is how this section started in the first place.
Absolutely. It's all the way through.
Again, as one would expect.
So when youth groups or parishioners ask me, well, if it was there,
I think he's slowly unlearning how to speak as we watch.
I would say, where would you find the fossils? And they'd say you'd find them on the outside. I said, yes.
What? If there was, you'd find fossils on the outside? Why? Are we just assuming that the alternative to Everest forming during the flood is also young Earth, but with Everest always having been there? I don't know anyone taking that position, but I guess he could be arguing for that. But the thing is that the primary opponent of young Earth flood geology is not other versions of young Earth flood geology. It's old Earth geology, or as I like to call it, geology. Also, since young Earth flood geology is playing make-believe and lying a bunch, I'm sure if you wanted Everest to predate the flood, you could come up with lots of ad hoc reasons why the fossils would be there all the way through the sedimentary rock of the Himalayas.
But why do we then find them all the way through Mount Everest?
Because the sediment that formed the rock of the Himalayas was deposited over the course of millions of years, during which marine organisms were living, breeding, and dying. Some of them died and had their hard parts sink into limey muck and were preserved. Some of them may have even been living at the bottom of the sea in such muck, and then a slump covered them and killed them in place. This is the kind of thing that is happening in various places right now. In fact, there is plenty of limey muck around Florida that is probably going to contain fossils beyond just the fossils it's made of in a few million years.
Why do we find them inside Mount Everest?
I feel like I just answered that.
And you get the mind then thinking, going, oh, okay, perhaps it wasn't there. Perhaps it was part of the sediments.
Or if you have a brain and think about it a little bit and maybe look into geology and sedimentology, you realize that it can't be a young feature whether pre or post-flood. The only way for it to form naturally is if it's actually millions of years old, and the only other option is magic. Now, you're allowed to believe in magic if you want, but let's just stop pretending that doing so is scientific. Of course, this means that things like anti-vax, chemtrails, flat Earth, and perhaps silliest of them all, young Earth creationism, aren't science, and are just magical thinking in the modern age.
That were eroded during the flood, placed on the ocean floor, filled with trillions of fossils, mainly marine.
Yeah, but way too many fossils. So many that they couldn't all possibly have been alive together during a year or so flood. The flood waters would have been less water and more of an organic sludge, like pond scum, but if the whole ocean was pond scum from top to bottom, rather than just a layer on top. Is that even a flood at that point? It seems more like the blob or maybe the monster from the raft. Creationists, like flat earthers, always propose solutions that just cause more problems. Oh well, at least he isn't showing the lowest quality possible photographs taken on a potato phone through binoculars and then claiming that he's photographed the actual firmament like Mikey Smith.
Mainly quite small.
Single-celled predominantly, so yeah, I'd say so.
And then raised up from there.
Hey, he got that part right.
In other words, we're misjudging the height of the flood by saying Everest was there at the time of the flood.
Okay, that mitigates the missing water problem, but it in no way solves it. Look, here's a map of the world with 75 meters of sea level increase, which would correspond to all the ice on Earth melting. Ignore that the map still has ice, that's just using a NASA satellite composite. One thing you might notice is that while it would be a disaster for Florida, Louisiana, Central Asia, the Amazon, and a few other places, most of the land is still there. And that's what land would be there if you just buzzsawed all the mountains down. Heck, even if we give it an extra order of magnitude, we just about get to where a global flood might be plausible if we pretend that all the high mountains like the Himalayas, Rockies, and Andes didn't exist until after the flood. Sorry, but we don't have an extra 100 or so polar ice caps to melt.
My argument, it was not. Why? Because it's riddled with marine fossils.
So this argument against young Earth pre-flood Everest is the fossils. Cool, but what's the argument against science on this one? I can honestly say I was not expecting this section to be about him countering a fringe creationism take about Everest, especially since creationism is already pretty damn fringe. It's so fringe, I kind of expect Walter and Peter Bishop to show up and begin investigating it.
Yeah, and you'd have to be below sea level to have marine life can't just start walking up mountains. It's got to be underwater.
You say that, but a common young Earth creationist explanation for the order of fossils in the strata is ecological zonation, where organisms that lived at higher elevations are found higher in the stratigraphic column. Of course, the problem with this is that there are marine organisms all the way through the stratigraphic column. So by inference, many young Earth creationist pseudogeologists do seem to be proposing that marine organisms walk up mountains or otherwise lived on mountains before the flood. Otherwise, how did they get into such high strata?
Yes, and the fact that the marine fossils are all through it.
It's weird that he keeps citing the evidence of the global antiquity of Mount Everest as evidence against its antiquity. I guess that's conspiracy theories for you.
Yeah.
It catches people off guard and they go, oh, okay.
Maybe it catches young Earth creationists who are just desperate to hear anything that assuages their cognitive dissonance caused by believing something so obviously untrue as young Earth creationism. I doubt it catches normal people off guard, though, and it certainly doesn't catch any geologists off guard.
Which then opens up the mind that the landscape did change dramatically, and these landmarks that appear that we've been talking about are actually a result of that interaction of the flood and the uplift and then the erosion that occurred, all within a very short period of time.
Which again is for all the landmarks we've discussed, Everest, the Grand Canyon, the Tibetan Plateau, Uluru, and the Three Sisters, absolutely physically impossible. And the best evidence to counter that Ron here has come up with, is to say that some paper says that the Three Sisters were formed under deep water that somehow formed a wall. And of course, he didn't cite that paper, and nothing I could find even remotely approached that kind of conclusion. So it seems like what happened is that he just made up a paper. That's the best he's done. An almost certainly made up paper. Now, do I know it was made up? Technically, no. Just like I don't know that the Second King of America is a PDF file. I just know that he's a rapist who definitely hung out with Jeffrey Epstein, who was in fact a PDF file, at his private island, where the latter did all of his PDF file stuff. So, it's one of those things where maybe it wouldn't hold up in a court of law, but if it looks, sounds, and smells like a dishonest pseudoscientific hack fraud, it just might be a dishonest pseudoscientific hack fraud.
Well, there certainly is a lot of evidence.
On the other hand, that's true. But on the other hand, none of it actually helps geology. In fact, pretty much all of it precludes flood geology. But also, are we already done with the focus on Everest? And now we're going on to an overview of the whole talk? That was damn fast. I was hoping Neller would at least pretend to have some arguments for a young Earth age for Everest. Instead, he just kind of said it couldn't have formed before the flood in a young Earth scenario, which, sure, okay, I don't really care to dispute that, but that in no way is even pretending that it confirms a young Earth, which I'll remind you, was what it was supposed to do based on the name of this video.
With all these different 5 landmarks pointing towards the global flood.
Something none of them do.
And a young Earth.
If anything, they point to that even less.
Can you summarize them all together? Because I remember earlier you mentioned, I think it was the Three Sisters. You actually put that in context of gorges or canyons and plateaus as well.
But not in the context of lions and tigers and bears, or bears beats in Battlestar Galactica.
So now we've got mountains. Can you piece it all together?
Of course he can't. He couldn't even do anything when he was focusing on each one individually. What on God's green earth would make anyone think that he could put all 5 of them together into anything even resembling a coherent argument for a young Earth and a global flood?
Just so we can think about, the Great Flood and how it would have caused all these landmarks.
Or so we can think about how the Great Green Arkle Seizure sneezed the Earth out one day. That's at least as plausible as this made-up bullshit. But whatever, let's see what Ronnie has to say.
Well, one of the blessings I had was travelling the world.
I needed a new heel for my shoe. So, I decided to go to Morganville, which is what they call Shelbyville in those days.
And so I was able to see patents.
He said patents, but I'm pretty sure he meant patterns.
Around the world. So I was different to potentially a lot of scientists who might be studying one feature in one location, trying to explain it in the sense of that location.
Oh, you see, he's not like other girls. Geologists do things like peer review for exactly this reason, and many actual real geologists do travel around the world. One that I know has traveled all across Eurasia and North America for his work. I think Ron might just be delusional. Not to say that he's delusional because he's a creationist or a Christian. Neither religions nor conspiracy theories are necessarily delusional. I know most people watching me don't do this, but it's fairly common for people in certain circles to conflate religion and delusion. Please don't do that.
My problem was how do I explain patterns of similarity around the world?
Probably with similar processes, but the thing is that for a process to operate all around the world, it doesn't need to be literally global in extent. Think about it like a global corporation. Although perhaps not for long if the former United States keeps having trade policies dictated by a narcissistic idiot with a mental age of -3 months. But that doesn't mean that anywhere in the world you will find a McDonald's. They're not in some countries, and even in countries where they can be found, they're not in every city, town, and village. They can be found all over the place, but not literally everywhere all at once. I think this analogy may have gotten away from me, and I just need a burger. The same is true in geology. Things like orogenies, floodplains, marine deposition, crossbedding, erosion, and uplift can be found all over the globe. But that doesn't mean that any of these things were at any time literally everywhere at the same time. They're worldwide phenomena, but they did not result from any single global phenomenon.
So when I gave you the example of the Tibetan Plateau, it's just one plateau.
Yep, that one plateau sure is a plateau. Of course, it's one that couldn't have been formed by a flood, and not even the sediment on it could have been formed by a big flood, never mind uplifting. But hey, that's just a preclusion to the flood model, and as we've learned from flat earthers, preclusionary evidence is not really a problem if you just lie hard enough.
Plateaus occupy 40% of the continents.
That seems too high to me, but I have no idea, and I don't particularly care. Nothing about the bare existence of a plateau means that there was a flood that formed it. In fact, as I have previously noted, even creationists know that plateaus couldn't have actually existed following the flood. Now, at the risk of repeating myself, I want to quote John Whitmore of Cedarville University in his article, The Potential for and Implications of Widespread Post-Flood Erosion and Mass Wasting Processes, published in the Proceedings of the International Conference on Creationism, Volume 7, 2013. In his conclusion, we can read this, quote, as the continents and mountains arose out of the floodwaters and were exposed as dry land, a number of denudation forces would have been immediately present, including water-saturated sediment, high precipitation rates, large storms, earthquakes, volcanic activity, rivers out of equilibrium, lack of vegetation, weakness in rocks, joints and faults, meteor impacts, isostatic rebound, plate tectonic movement, climate change, and ice age floods. These processes would have been expected to occur with rates and magnitudes that are rarely, if ever, experienced today. Many of these processes would have been local, but their widespread and cumulative nature would have radically changed landscapes everywhere. Because of these processes, the immediate post-flood landscape would have been rapidly eroded and likely had the appearance of badlands before trees and grasses could become re-established. In all likelihood, these processes would have totally removed any planation surfaces, water gaps, pediments, and other such features that have been imagined forming just after the continents were lifted out of the oceans at the flood's end. In my opinion, it is unthinkable that these kinds of features would have survived the post-flood world unless they were immediately buried. So yeah, even other creationists know that this just isn't a plausible explanation for plateaus.
45%, 60% of Africa.
I don't really care what the percent is, since the more it is, the less plausible it is that Earth was ever covered by a global flood.
And so when I started to look at all these different landmarks,
he just decided to be as obtuse and immune to critical analysis as possible.
And each of them pointed towards a commonality around the globe, but a commonality in their formation rather than a different argument for every location.
Yeah, that's just different rocks forming in the same way in different places. We don't need a global flood for that. It's like noticing that you can find tornado damage all over the world and then deciding that therefore there must have been a global tornado. That doesn't follow at all.
I began to see a tapestry, a woven tapestry of how the Earth has been shaped as a result of a global flood.
I'm going to hit X to doubt on that one. The thing is that when you actually hear the testimony of creationists, it always starts with them accepting some particularly conservative version of usually Christianity, often but not always evangelical Protestantism, then deciding that science is at odds with that, and then deciding that they will abandon science in order to do pseudoscience, according to them, to show how God's word is right. Of course, to an outside observer, what it looks like is them abandoning empiricism and critical thinking in an effort to lower their cognitive dissonance. The thing is that if there were really actually evidence of a global flood, it would be either the consensus or at least in the running to be the consensus. That's because fundamentally, while geologists don't care about the Bible, they do care about evidence. That's the whole point of geology. The first geologists went into it expecting to find that the global flood would be the dominant aspect of the history of the Earth's rocks, and they expected to find ubiquitous evidence of it. Instead, they found not only no evidence of the flood, but evidence that precluded it. Geology was started by people who accepted a history of the world that would be recognizable to Neller as his view, or one very similar to it. But they did not hold that view dogmatically, and when the evidence did not bear out that story, it was abandoned.
So sort of like the Bible is a tapestry woven together.
Which is why it frequently contradicts itself, sometimes within the same chapter. The Bible was written in different times by different people in different circumstances to different audiences. That's why Joseph gets sold by his brothers to two different groups of people before he's sold to Potiphar. That's why both David and Elhanan killed Goliath. That's why in Genesis 1 everything is declared good by God, but in the Adam and Eve story it is not good for Adam to be alone, even though that's how he was created. That's why gospel harmonies exist, because the narratives in the gospels don't line up. And yet despite this fact, Ron Neller thinks that he can use this internally inconsistent text as a literal history of the world. Of course, in doing so, he has to emphasize some parts of the text while rationalizing away other parts. And so his reading is no more faithful or literal than any other reading. Creationism isn't just bad science, it's bad exegesis, it's bad Bible scholarship, and while perhaps it's not my place to say this, I think it's bad theology.
So too is our planet. Its features, whether they be Tibetan Plateau or gorges, all indicate a global flood.
Then it was a global flood that violates the laws of physics. But if we start with the premise that the laws of physics don't get to be violated by our scientific hypotheses, which we must do, otherwise our hypotheses are untestable, then in fact the evidence says that it is physically impossible that a global flood occurred on Earth at any time for which we have evidence. The evidence also says that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. That common ancestry is true, that the Hebrews were never enslaved in Egypt as a group, that there was no conquest of Canaan by the Hebrews, and that there was never a fully unified kingdom of Israel until after the Babylonian exile. The fact is that if you just go by the data, then basically every bit of alleged history in the Bible until into the Iron Age is simply not actually literally true. If you are a member of a faith tradition that holds these texts sacred, I'm not here to tell you to leave that tradition. But I will say that you need to face the fact that the histories of the Bible of the Bronze Age and early Iron Age events range from completely untrue to heavily embellished. Find a way to integrate that into your practice of your religious tradition, or just be happy being wrong about such things, I suppose. But what you absolutely should not do is spread pseudoscience, pseudohistory, or pseudoarchaeology in an effort to pretend otherwise.
Let me put all that together for you now then. Massive flood tears this planet apart.
No, it didn't.
Absolutely rips it apart. There is no Mount Everest. The whole thing is torn apart. Deposited, and the water flow at this stage now would have been about 3 kilometres deep over all of the sedimentary and remaining bedrock features on the planet.
Which importantly would leave us with a single flood deposit that is graded hydrologically. So there would be a single thick stratum around the world with small grains on top and progressively larger grains at the bottom, full of things like larger stones up to boulder size scattered through it, as well as fossil remains sorted just like the grains, largely by size and density with no regard for habitat or taxonomy. The problem is that this very simple prediction of the idea of a global flood is not what we actually see. Instead, we see strata ordered with no regard for hydrologic sorting across the strata, with sedimentary rocks with entirely different cementing agents, meaning that they could not have formed in a single body of water. We see fossils not arranged by their hydrodynamic qualities, but by taxonomy and habitat. It is hard to imagine how the geology of the planet could possibly look less like it was the result of a global flood.
3 kilometres deep. Massive amounts of sediment that we would never see being deposited by rivers today.
Except that he gave no such citations. He just pointed out that most sedimentary formations are not well explained by a small flood. Seemed to make up a paper that said that one sandstone formation in Australia was deposited under deep water, a claim I could find no evidence of in the published literature, and then just claimed that if it was deep water and not a small flood, it must have been a big flood? Even if I take everything he said at face value, it still doesn't add up to the rocks of Earth being compatible at all with a global flood. Never mind a positive reason to accept any such flood.
Filled with trillions of fossils.
Which again is a problem, not a feature. There are places where the ground is basically made of fossils. Far, far too many fossils to have all been alive during a year-long flood. And on top of that, we know that only a fraction of organisms get fossilized, so the actual number of living things around during the flood would have been even larger than just the number of fossils. Further, the bare existence of fossils is not dispositive when it comes to science versus young Earth creationism. Both expect fossils to exist.
And we cannot even find those fossils being created today. We don't have the sediment that need to create those fossils.
Well, that's just a lie. Fossils are forming today, and we even have a term for the remains of an organism that are undergoing a fossilization process. They're called subfossils.
But the point is then, they are lifted up. As the Lord said, I will raise the land and lower the sea floor.
Let's read some of that psalm, specifically verses 1 through 13, because context is important. This is from the New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. Quote,
Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty, wrapped in light as with a garment. You stretch out the heavens like a tent. You set the beams of your chambers on the waters. You make the clouds your chariot. You ride on the wings of the wind. You made the winds your messengers, fire and flame your ministers. You set the earth on its foundations so that it may never be shaken. You cover it with the deep as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they flee. At the sound of your thunder they take flight. They rose up to the mountains, ran down to the valleys, to the place that you appointed them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they may not again cover the earth. You make springs gush forth in the valleys, they flow between the hills, giving drink to every wild animal. The wild asses quench their thirst. By the streams the birds of the air have their habitation, they sing among the branches. From your lofty abode you water the mountains, the earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work.
End quote. So does Ron Neller think that the heavens are in fact like a tent, that is some surface vaulted over the earth, implying a flat earth with a dome over it? I doubt it. Does Ron think that God has a room in the sky supported by beams that extend into the ocean? I doubt it. Does Ron think that God rides clouds like a chariot? I doubt it. Does Ron think that Earth has foundations so that it doesn't move? I doubt that. especially since Earth does move both relative to itself in terms of plate tectonics and earthquakes, and it also moves through the solar system and galaxy. Also, I would contend that the psalm is about creation, not the flood. So even the part where the water covers the mountains and flee at the rebuke of God is more likely connected to God separating the water from the land in Genesis than the flood of Noah. So Ron is just grabbing a verse probably about creation from a poem or song, most of which he would reject as literally true. It's hard to see how this could possibly be done in good faith.
As that land is raised, we get these incredible plateaus as it's raised up because it's sedimentary strata. Some of it is tilted, like Uluru, but most of it comes up like this. So you're creating plateaus. But as the water runs off from the flood, what you then have is it concentrates into gorges and valleys and carves them up, leaving beautiful features.
Let's just remind ourselves that even other creationists know that plateaus couldn't exist if they were formed the way Kneller wants us to think they were formed.
Along the edges of the gorges. So you've got massive plateaus, deep gorges, as we've seen, even in Tibet. It's 3 to 4 kilometres deep at least, those gorges, with incredible features like the Three Sisters in the Katoomba Gorge area in there.
It's like he thinks that just listing a bunch of geological features and saying that they were caused by a flood is enough. And I want to emphasize that he only relied on one unnamed paper for all of this. The entire talk so far can be summed up as Ron Kneller saying, "It was a flood, trust me, bro," for nearly an hour. Well, no one should trust creationists. They should provide evidence or they should be dismissed. They should be treated like flat earthers. Just ask them for their citations and their data. If they have none, then if they're claiming to be a scientist, just mock them. If they're lay people who are just believing what people they trust have told them, then point out how untrustworthy those people are.
And then some of these sedimentary rocks, as the floodwaters continue to run off, removing all the weaker rocks and the sediment, left Inselbergs. Beautiful features, testimony of the massive removal of the sediment around them, the rock around them, because they're weaker rocks and all of that.
That is how Inselbergs form, but nothing about that requires rapid flooding or flood runoff. In fact, if that is actually how they were formed, we would expect them to actually be the wide part of a teardrop-shaped hill with the tail being composed of the weaker sediment. Because that's what we actually see in cases of massive flooding. When the floodwater runs up against something, it can't simply erode away. That isn't what we see at most Inselbergs, so the flood explanation is inadequate.
And then even when you step away from the plateaus, and all the features attached to the plateaus, and I could go into many more as well.
I wonder if any of them would actually provide positive evidence for his position. Based on his track record, I doubt it.
Even if you then turn your attention to the mountain ranges, you will find that the mountain ranges around the world are riddled with fossils all through them. Whether you're in the Andes, the Himalayas, doesn't matter where you are, in the Rockies, they are riddled with fossils basically all through.
Right, like we'd expect if the sediment that makes them up was deposited over time with organisms living, breeding, and dying where the sedimentation took place. And of course, neither the sediment nor the fossils are sorted in a way that makes sense in a flood, which sorts things according to hydrodynamic properties, not taxonomy and habitat, which, as I've already said, is how they're actually sorted.
And so therefore we know they were formed down, they rose up at certain points, create spectacular mountain ranges.
That's true.
But they did so after the great flood when the Lord raised it with his hand.
Yeah, actually, I've got one more question. You talk about the Lord raising the mountains and things like that, and I guess it's almost a bit poetic language, but...
Yeah, it is poetic. That's why it's organized into couplets and contains a lot of stuff that no one I'm aware of thinks is literally true. Why does this guy seem like he's got more brain power than the alleged expert he's interviewing?
Can that be explained in terms of the mechanism that God used, I guess, by tectonics? Is that something that I've heard that before? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think he's asking whether the uplift of mountains and plateaus and such is the result of plate tectonics. In real life it is, but I'm not sure if that's true in the fantasy land that Ron Kneller lives in.
Yes, we have a lot of discussion in the Creation Ministries International on our website.
Not in any peer-reviewed literature, I guess.
On plate tectonics. And there's a lot more to learn because you are talking about processes quite deep in the planet. And so there is little doubt that the plate tectonics has roles to play, and we have interesting discussions amongst ourselves as to how that occurred and so on. But certainly plate tectonics is a feature of all of this because we also had volcanic activity, we had shifting of plates and all that sort of thing.
Well, at least he's not disputing plate tectonics. That's good. Of course, there is a problem with young Earth plate tectonics. They need at least a few 100 million years worth of movement to happen in about a year. Now, the guy who proposed this is named Baumgartner, and he created what is called catastrophic plate tectonics, which is the model that Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International tend to hold to. But he himself admits that his model generates enough heat from friction to boil the oceans and melt the crust of the Earth. So this explanation is physically impossible, and Baumgartner himself admits this and just says that a miracle is needed. But once miracles are an option, hypothesis testing is impossible, and what you're doing isn't evidence-based science, it's something else entirely. I would contend that it's pseudoscience.
Again, we need to be very careful how to interpret the movements of plates.
We do, but I'm guessing that when he says that, he doesn't mean the same thing that I do. When I say that, what I mean is that we need to carefully consider all available evidence and not go beyond the confidence that the evidence actually warrants. I suspect that what he means is that we need to be careful that the evidence we look at is only the evidence that can be twisted into corroborating a dogmatic conclusion, and that all other evidence needs to be rejected or even just ignored, lest Ron realize that he's wrong.
We always make the mistake, I feel, as scientists. We measure something today and we assume it was the same rate before.
No, we don't. We check. The idea that a rate today is constant through time is a hypothesis, one that we can test. And when we test it, we can find that it varies, or that it can't. And when we find a rate that can vary, we can also test to see what the bounds are of the variation. But these are things that are indeed tested, not just assumed. This is why strict uniformitarianism has not been a part of geology for decades. We know that rates can and do vary across time, and so geologists actually do accept rapid and catastrophic processes, but only when the evidence warrants it, and that warrant is provided by hypothesis testing, not just complaining that the evidence should agree with an incoherent interpretation of an internally contradictory set of texts from the Iron Age.
We constantly make that mistake.
Ironically true of creationists, who will hold things like population growth rates and the rate of change of the strength of the dipole moment of the geomagnetic field as constant, all while pretending that maybe things like the speed of light or the rate of spontaneous decay in radioactive isotopes might have just varied wildly. If there's something that can't vary in rate, you can bet that creationists will propose that it did vary. And if there's something that can vary, they'll probably propose that it is a hard fact of the universe set in stone and the rate cannot ever possibly vary. It's like they live in an opposite world.
By measuring a process today. So with plate tectonics, we have a long time to wait because it's a very slow process. So by the time we actually measure any change in the rate, whether it's declining or increasing, that's too far away.
Actually, we can measure changes right now, because the rate of movement of the plates of the Earth's crust is currently being measured with high precision, and we know that it varies because not all the plates have the same velocity right now. Further, we also have access to physics, so we can tell things like how much extra heat would be generated by the movement of plates at different rates. And we have access to the thermal history of at least some rocks. For example, we have radiation tracks in igneous rocks that trace the path of various particles given off when atomic nuclei decay. These are preserved in rocks like granite, but at certain temperatures they will disappear. The temperature at which this happens is called the annealing temperature. So if we predict a rate of movement for the plates, then we can see how much heat that results in, check things like the thermal diffusivity of Earth's crust, the specific heat capacity of various rocks, and then we can see what temperatures those rocks would have gotten to given a particular model of plate tectonics. If that temperature is above the annealing temperature for a given rock, and your model predicts that that rock formed before or during this accelerated movement, you can just check to see that the rock has these tracks. If they do, then the temperature of the rock did not go above the annealing temperature, and boom, you've tested your model. The problem is that most rocks on Earth do not show evidence of this heating event some 4.5 thousand years ago, meaning that when we test the hypothesis of catastrophic plate tectonics, it is falsified, all while assuming variable rates of plate movement.
But no, it is an important part, again, of these features.
Yeah.
It sure is, which is why geologists don't just ignore that stuff. Instead, they actually get answers about it, and then creationists just pretend that it never happened.
Well, it's an interesting side note. It's probably even a topic for a whole nother interview. So,
heck, I would be quite interested in such a thing. I would love to know the ways that creationists get around the fact that geologists actually don't ignore catastrophes or variable rate processes, and in fact test for such things and include them in their models. I bet we would hear a whole new crop of lies, and for some reason I'm apparently inexhaustibly hungry for creationist lies. It sort of is my job, after all.
I might, for listeners who are interested, maybe they can just check out creation.com.
Creation.com.
I'm sure there's plenty of information there.
Yes.
Or maybe check with actual geologists and read some actual geology papers. In fact, most papers include an email address for at least one author so they can be contacted if you have questions about their paper. In my experience, most paper authors are thrilled to have someone actually contact them interested in their papers and will answer questions you have about things you do not understand. More people really should read primary literature about topics they're interested in. It can be daunting to get into, but since the literature is where the science happens, if you really want to stay up to date with science surrounding some topic, it's by far the best way to do so. It can also inoculate you against pseudoscientific grifters, like Ron Neller, Andrew Wakefield, Brett and Eric Weinstein, Dave Weiss, Ken Ham, etc. The world desperately needs more scientific literacy. So be the change we need in the world and literally just become literate in reading real science.
But thanks so much for sharing about all these different landmarks.
Sharing is not the verb I would have used. I would have used something more like lying or misinforming.
I thought that was fascinating.
My pleasure.
There's a lot of things where I think just when I'm going on long car trips on the road, even seeing the cross-bedding, in the middle of the cutouts when you drive through.
Which, remember, just indicates fluid flow. It doesn't even on its own indicate aqueous deposition. If you misinterpret as much evidence as needed, then you can always find evidence for any position you'd like to take. The problem arises when you don't have a preconceived conclusion and just let the evidence take you where it leads. When you do that, it turns out that the Earth is round, it orbits the sun, gravity is real, vaccines don't cause autism, 1 × 1 = 1, evolution is real, there never was a global flood, and the Bible is not a reliable text for Bronze Age history. You don't have to like it, but that's why those things are the consensus. The evidence says they're true. Now, of course, Neller and his ilk would disagree, which is fine, but if they want to show that the evidence doesn't lead there, they'll have to first stop misrepresenting both the evidence and the science based on it.
And even, I know where I am, there's a few different mountain-like features.
Mountain-like features? So, like, hills? What does that even mean?
Which have that flood sort of aspect to them, or geology, which I think I'll think about differently now when I pass them.
I hate that so much. That guy really does seem like he's got a decent head on his shoulders, but has for some reason chosen to accept on authority pseudoscientific nonsense. And now he'll just go and interpret things in the world, which often preclude his beliefs from being true, and see them as evidence of just the opposite. All because people he trusts have been lying to him. And this is also training him not to trust science in cases where he really doesn't have the time to check on it for himself, which for most of us is most of science. This is why creationists so often fall for other pseudoscience and conspiracy nonsense, like drinking raw milk, not believing in germs, chemtrails, flat earth, anti-vax nonsense, QAnon, etc. Once your brain is trained to reject science and accept things based on confirmation and belief bias, it's hard to get out of that. I would know. I was a young Earth creationist once upon a time, as are a large number of the people I've collaborated with, like Vice Rhino, Paulo Gia, Gutsick Gibbon, my co-host Ben Hoven, no relation, as well as all the people I ever interviewed for my series Leaving Creationism, which includes audience members like Guptu3, as well as even one family member, my brother, Philip. It wasn't easy for any of us, and people like Ron Neller try to make it harder.
Yes.
And consider, how does that fit into the Great Flood?
Not to spoil the ending, but it doesn't. Like, at all. I would go so far as to say that flood geology is less plausible than flat Earth. That might be my own bias showing, but really, I think the evidence against the flood might be stronger than the evidence against a flat Earth, even though the evidence against a flat Earth is easier to gather as just some layperson who isn't trained in science. Of course, now that I've said that, I'm sure I'll get complaints from MC Toon and Craig McNeil.
I've been told by numerous people who I've shared this message with that they can no longer go into the landscape and admire its beauty.
Well, that's sad. Ron Neller just telling on himself as a guy who ruins people's ability to enjoy nature. What a weird flex.
They are too busy now trying to work out how the flood carved this part or that part or this part. So.
And of course, they've closed themselves off to questioning whether a flood is a plausible or even possible option for how geomorphology got to be the way it is. Going around and asking how the data fit into your theory is the opposite of how science works. Science works from the data to hypothesis to test. Creationism works from unquestionable conclusion based on more or less nothing to forcing data to fit, and rarely if ever does it get around to testing. Young Earth creationism is as antithetical to science as it is possible to be, despite their pretense of being scientific and loving what they call true science.
They can't unsee it.
Can't
It's all there.
unsee it. It's there, and it becomes more obvious the more you study this and the more you look at it from another perspective, from a biblical perspective, you see it.
Well, of course, that's just saying that if you intentionally increase your belief bias, then your beliefs will seem more plausible and seem to have greater explanatory power. But that's not the same thing as actually being able to interpret the evidence accurately. That's rather the opposite.
It's clear-cut.
Yes, it is clear-cut, just not in the way that Neller would prefer.
Now, you mentioned creation.com before.
A site that's somehow even worse than Evolution News and the Daily Mail for getting accurate information.
Which is a great place for people to learn about these landmarks and many other things. But there's also another resource that I'm aware of, which is Creation Magazine.
You know, I signed up for that free, and even gave them my address. So far, not a single one has shown up. On the other hand, I gave Ray Comfort's organization my address and requested the maximum number of his Coronation Bible tracts, so I could destroy them. And those showed up as requested. It's not a great look when you're shown up by Ray Comfort.
So we have this, which comes out, I think it's 4 times a year, and it's just full of great articles.
Well, great if you're looking for humor, or you're like me, and reading and showing why this stuff is wrong is your job.
A lot of these articles written by scientists.
Incorrect. Essentially none of them are. Many of them are trained by people who have the credentials to be scientists, but who have instead chosen to be pseudoscientists.
With qualifications.
That part is indisputable. They certainly have the qualifications to do science in the fields that they write about in many cases. But that's not really a good thing. What that means is that these authors know better, and so when they so wildly misrepresent the data and the work of scientists, they still know better. They choose what I consider to be the worst option in the triangle. You see, as has been said by Aaron Robb, myself, and others, among honest, well-informed, and creationist, you can be at most 2. Now, when creationists are honest and misinformed, I do not consider that their fault. Anyone can fall into the trap of believing nonsense because they don't know enough to investigate for themselves, and then having people they trust misinforming them. It happened to me, and I don't consider that to be some big failing of mine, at least not in terms of creationism. My decision to join up to help murder people under color of law around the world was something I consider a big failure of mine. But people who know better and decide to just be dishonest in defense of young Earth creationism are, in my opinion, some of the worst people. And not so much because young Earth creationism is on its own harmful, but because, as I've said, pseudoscience and conspiracies always lead to more, and creationism can be a gateway drug into things like far-right ideologies, medical misinformation, climate change denial, etc. Things that actually get people killed. That's what I ultimately care about. I want people to generally have good, safe, and healthy lives to the extent possible. PhD creationists work directly against that, and that's without even taking into account their horrific homophobia, transphobia, and usually Islamophobia and anti-Semitism.
Can you tell us more about Creation Magazine and the things we could read in it?
Oh, absolutely. This is probably our most significant connecting to the community.
I feel like this is now just a commercial for Creation Magazine.
It is a brilliant magazine. So this particular issue is the latest issue at this time of filming, and in 2024. And surprisingly, as we talk about landmarks and land features and so on, is that even in this, as you see there is an article on Devil's Tower, the one I mentioned earlier.
I remember that, yeah.
And so each issue will have something to do with earth science and geology. It'll have something to do with biology or ecosystems, something to do with astrophysics, a children's section.
Yep, this is just a commercial. Well, I'm not going to keep letting that go on, so I guess this is where I'll call it for the day. Oddly enough, this last section was the one that angered me the least. It was just a bunch of nothing. Oh well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please hit like on the video and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. And remember, if you want to support what I do, please consider joining the channel memberships or the Patreon. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Tapioca Weasel, Arrow Dodger, Dan Sheedy, Elleron Teller, Phil Rivera, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostock van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Vollis, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, and John Ackerman. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.